There's a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Who were the first Americans? Say it out loud, and it feels like it should have a clean, textbook response. A name, a date, a migration route drawn on a map with a neat dotted line. But the more you pull on that thread, the more the whole thing unravels into something far stranger and more fascinating than any textbook version ever prepared you for. Here's the problem with the phrase "first Americans" right from the start. It assumes there was one group, one migration, one moment when humans stepped onto an empty continent and said, "Here we are, we made it." But the archaeological and genetic evidence is telling us something messier and more interesting than that. It's suggesting there may have been multiple waves, multiple routes, multiple peoples arriving at different times from different directions, each of them layering their story on top of the last. So when someone asks who were the first Americans, the honest answer might be, which ones? And then comes the deeper mystery. The one that keeps researchers staring at spreadsheets and cave walls and radiocarbon dates at 2 in the morning. Some of these early groups seem to just disappear. You can find their tools, you can find their hearths, the bones of the animals they hunted, the faint outlines of where they sheltered. And then the record goes quiet. Not gradually, not with a slow fade, but with the kind of silence that makes you stop and ask, what happened here? That's the question at the heart of this whole story. Not just who were the first Americans, but what happened to them? Why do some of the earliest traces of human life on this continent seem to lead nowhere? Why do certain archaeological cultures bloom into something remarkable and then vanish from the evidence, leaving later peoples who look genetically and culturally distinct? Where did they go? Were they absorbed? Did they move? Did they die? Were they simply never as isolated as we assumed? If you're listening from somewhere far away right now, maybe it's late and quiet wherever you are. Maybe the house has finally settled. I want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Seriously, it's one of my favourite things, seeing Tokyo at midnight and Toronto at 11, and someone in New Zealand who apparently has very particular taste in late-night history content. You are all part of the same weird global conversation happening in the dark, and I love that. And if you want more of this without any ads interrupting the drift, the best thing you can do is follow the show on Spotify. No ads, no music layered underneath, just the story and the silence around it. The link is in the description. It genuinely helps keep this going. Now, back to the mystery, because there isn't one answer. There are several, and they're not mutually exclusive. They overlap and contradict and complicate each other in ways that make this one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in the entire field of human prehistory. The first explanation is climate. The Americas that the earliest people entered were not the Americas that exist today. The landscape was almost unrecognizable. Glaciers covered enormous stretches of the northern continent. Sea levels were different. Ecosystems that no longer exist were thriving. There were grasslands where there are now forests, shallow inland seas where there are now deserts, and corridors of passable land that would eventually flood or freeze shut. When the climate shifted at the end of the last ice age, it didn't just change the scenery. It changed everything about what was survivable and where. Groups that had built their entire way of life around certain animals, certain plant communities, certain predictable seasonal rhythms suddenly found themselves in a world that no longer worked the way it used to. The second explanation is changing lifeways. Some of the groups that seem to disappear from the record may not have disappeared at all. They may have simply changed so completely that we stop recognizing them. A people who hunted megafauna across open grasslands look very different in the archaeological record from their grandchildren, who foraged along river systems and harvested shellfish and built semi-permanent camps. Same genetic lineage, completely different material culture. And material culture is mostly what survives. If you're looking for the same type of spear point, and you don't find it, you might conclude the people are gone. But maybe they just stopped making that kind of spear point. The third explanation is disease. This one is complicated because we tend to think of epidemic disease as something that arrived with European contact in the 1400s and 1500s. And that wave was catastrophic in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. But disease was moving through human populations long before Columbus. Ancient pathogens, parasites, viral and bacterial infections spreading along trade routes and migration corridors, shaping population dynamics in ways we're only beginning to reconstruct through ancient DNA analysis. Some early population collapses may have had biological causes that left no obvious signature in the stone tool record. The fourth explanation is conflict. When resources contract, when drought tightens its grip on a landscape, when several different groups find themselves competing for the same shrinking pool of viable territory, things get violent. The archaeological record from certain periods and regions shows evidence of trauma, of fortified settlements, of populations contracting into defensible positions. Conflict alone rarely explains a complete disappearance. But combined with climate stress and resource scarcity, it can push a population that was already struggling past the point of recovery. The fifth explanation is migration. Groups that seem to vanish from one region may have simply moved to another. The continent is enormous. A band of 200 people walking away from a collapsing ecosystem leaves almost no trace. They might show up 2,000 miles away under a different archaeological label, recognized eventually by geneticists, who notice the shared ancestry but not yet fully connected to the people they came from. And the sixth explanation, arguably the most important one for keeping all of this honest, is misinterpretation. We are reading a record full of gaps with tools that were only invented recently and methods that are still being refined. A lot of what looks like disappearance may be a failure of preservation. Organic materials rot. Sites get buried under river sediment or eroded off cliff faces or built over by later settlements. The absence of evidence is genuinely not the same thing as evidence of absence, and the history of American archaeology is littered with confident conclusions that had to be walked back when new dating methods or new excavation techniques revealed something that had been there all along. So this is where we're starting, with a phrase that sounds simple and isn't, with a mystery that has too many answers rather than too few. With the understanding that what happened to the earliest peoples of the Americas is not a single story, but a braided one, different threads running alongside each other, sometimes merging, sometimes fraying apart, sometimes disappearing underground for a while before surfacing somewhere unexpected. Over the course of this story, we're going to follow those threads as carefully as the evidence allows. We're going to talk about who these people were, how they got here, what their lives looked like, what the world was doing around them, and what the current best thinking is about why some of their stories seem to end before they should. There are no clean answers waiting at the finish line, but there is something better than clean answers. There's a picture that keeps getting richer the longer you look at it. And we have time tonight. So let's look. Before we can talk about what happened to the first Americans, we need to spend a moment on what we even mean by that phrase. Because the label is doing a lot of work, and if we don't unpack it carefully, we're going to be confusing 3 or 4 completely different things every time we use it. There's a difference, and it matters, between the first people to set foot on this continent, the first cultures that left enough archaeological evidence for us to reconstruct them in any meaningful detail, and the named nations and confederacies that European explorers and colonizers eventually encountered and documented. Those 3 categories are not the same group. They're not even close to the same time frame. Between the first footprints and the first European written records, there are somewhere between 15 and 25,000 years of human history on this continent. Maybe more, possibly much more. That gap contains multitudes. Think about what 15,000 years actually means in terms of human change. 15,000 years ago in Europe, the ice sheets were still retreating. There was no writing, no agriculture, no cities. The people who would eventually become the Greeks, the Romans, the Norse, the Celts, all of them were still thousands of years away from anything we'd recognize as their distinct cultural identity. 15,000 years is enough time for languages to become mutually incomprehensible, for technologies to rise and be forgotten and reinvented, for entire ways of life to cycle through multiple complete transformations. When archaeologists talk about the first Americans, they're often talking about people who are about as connected to the nations Columbus encountered as Paleolithic cave painters in France are connected to the French Revolution. Same continent, radically different world. So let's set up some vocabulary that will help carry us through the rest of this story. When researchers talk about the earliest inhabitants, they mean people who arrived during what's called the Pleistocene, the geological epoch that ended roughly 11,000 years ago, give or take, when the last ice age wound down. These people are often invisible to us except through the faintest traces. A few hearth sites, some flaked stone. Occasionally, rarely, an intact camp or rock shelter with enough organic material left to date. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their languages. We know them almost entirely through what they left behind in the ground, and what they left behind is a very incomplete sentence. Then there are the archaeologically visible cultures. These are groups that show up more clearly in the record, not because they were necessarily larger or more important, but because enough time hasn't passed to destroy everything they made. These cultures often get named by the site where their tools were first identified. Clovis, named for a town in New Mexico. Folsom, same region. Windover, a Florida burial site. But here's something worth holding on to. When archaeologists name a culture after a tool type or a site, they're not naming a people. They're naming a pattern, a recognizable style of stone working, a particular way of treating the dead, a characteristic kind of hearth arrangement. That pattern might represent a single coherent ethnic group, or it might represent a technology that spread across dozens of different groups who shared nothing else in common. We usually can't tell from the artifacts alone. This is one of the places where archaeology and popular imagination tend to part ways. Popular accounts want to say the Clovis people did this. The Clovis people went there as if Clovis were a nation with a clear sense of shared identity. But the people who made Clovis-style points across North and South America may have been about as unified as the people who all happen to use similar smartphones today. A shared technology doesn't require a shared identity, and the absence of a shared technology doesn't mean the people using it disappeared. It might just mean fashions changed. Here's something that makes this even more interesting. Continuity in human populations doesn't always look like continuity in the artifact record. A people can remain in a region for thousands of years, maintaining an unbroken thread of lineage and memory and cultural practice, and still produce archaeological layers that look completely different from one period to the next. Maybe they shifted from hunting large animals to fishing. Maybe a new raw material became available that changed how they made tools. Maybe contact with a neighbouring group introduced new techniques that spread rapidly. If you're an archaeologist pulling a cross-section of sediment from a site, those shifts can look like one group replacing another. But the genetic evidence increasingly suggests that in many regions, the same underlying population was there the whole time, just living differently. This is a really important corrective for our purposes tonight, because some of what looks like disappearance in the story of early American peoples is almost certainly this. It's transformation misread as replacement, people adapting so thoroughly to new conditions that their material signature becomes unrecognizable. The hearths are still being lit, the children are still being taught, the stories are still being told, but the spear points look different now, and that's what archaeologists find. So from the outside it can seem like the curtain came down and a new caste walked on. The deep time of American prehistory is also deeply regional. This is another thing that gets flattened out when we talk about the first Americans as a single story. The experience of a group living on the coast of what is now Chile 12,000 years ago had almost nothing in common with the experience of a group living in the subarctic forests of what is now Canada at the same moment. Different climate, different resources, different pressures, different trajectories. The story of early human life in the Amazon basin is not the same story as the one unfolding on the Great Plains, or in the desert southwest, or in the river valleys of the southeast. There are dozens of distinct regional stories, each with their own timeline, their own cast of peoples, their own moments of flourishing and difficulty. When we talk about what happened to the first Americans, we sometimes need to ask which region, which time window, which specific thread we're following, because the answers vary considerably depending on where you point your attention. What most of these regional stories share, though, is depth. Real, staggering, hard-to-grasp depth. Archaeological evidence now places humans in parts of South America with increasing confidence at dates that push well beyond 15,000 years ago. Some sites are producing dates that researchers are still arguing about, contested not because the dating methods are wrong, but because the implications are so significant, they require multiple rounds of independent verification. The deeper the record goes, the more it suggests that the peopling of the Americas was not a single dramatic sprint across a land bridge by one pioneering group, but a long, complicated, multi-chapter process involving multiple populations, multiple routes and timescales that make even the older estimates feel abbreviated. Multiple migrations is the working model that most researchers are operating with right now. Not one wave, but several, arriving at different times and by different routes, with different ancestral origins and different genetic signatures. Some of these groups may have met and merged. Others may have remained separate for thousands of years before eventually encountering each other. Some may have arrived and then declined before later migrants arrived and filled the same territories, leaving a genetic ghost of the earlier people underneath the dominant signal of the later ones. Ancient DNA is getting good enough now to detect some of these layers, and what it's finding is a picture of American prehistory that is considerably more complex than anything the artifact record alone suggested. What this means for our story is that there isn't one answer to the mystery of disappearing peoples. There's a whole landscape of answers, and the terrain shifts depending on where and when you're looking. Some of what looks like disappearance is cultural transformation. Some of it is regional migration, people moving rather than dying. Some of it is genuine population collapse, groups that really did decline to the point where they left no continuous descendants. And some of it, as we'll keep coming back to, is simply the silence of a record that preserves only a fraction of what actually happened. The people who first walked onto this continent were not a prologue to someone else's story. They were fully realized human beings with complex social lives, sophisticated knowledge of the landscapes they moved through, and long histories of their own that stretched back across the land bridge, and before that into the deep ancestry of Asia. Calling them simply the first Americans risks flattening all of that into a single label that carries very little actual information. So when we use that phrase going forward, let's hold it lightly. Let's remember it's a convenience, not a description. And let's stay curious about what sits underneath it. Because what sits underneath it is a story, or really dozens of overlapping stories that we're still in the early stages of understanding. The threads are long and tangled, and some of them lead somewhere surprising. We'll start following them now. To follow those threads, we have to go back to the threshold moment itself, how people got here in the first place. Because before we can talk about disappearances inside the Americas, there's a quieter, earlier disappearance to think about. The moment when certain lineages simply kept walking and never went back. Right now, most researchers would tell you there are two main frameworks for how that crossing happened, over a northern landmass called Beringia, and along the Pacific coastline by boat and foot. They're not mutually exclusive, in fact, they're probably entangled, but they emphasize different pieces of the puzzle. Beringia first. If you imagine a map of the world during the last ice age, drop the sea level by 100 meters or more, suck a vast volume of water into mile-thick ice sheets sitting on top of Canada and the northern United States. Something interesting happens in the northwest corner. The shallow sea floor between what is now Siberia and Alaska rises into the air, not as a narrow bridge you could walk across in an afternoon, but as a huge, sprawling landmass, thousands of kilometers wide, a subcontinent. That's Beringia. For a long time, popular accounts framed it as a kind of icy causeway, a frozen freeway that people hurried across on their way to warmer lands. The picture that has emerged over the last few decades is very different. Beringia, at least in its central parts, does not seem to have been a wall of ice. It looks more like a mammoth steppe ecosystem. Cold, yes, but dry and relatively open. Grasses, herbs, shrubs, herds of grazing animals. Mammoth, bison, horse, steppe antelope, moving seasonally across a treeless, windy plain. Predators following them, and at some point, people. In this view, Beringia wasn't just a route, it was a place people lived. Possibly for thousands of years. Genetic studies even talk about a Beringian standstill, a period when the ancestors of Indigenous Americans seem to have been isolated from other Asian populations long enough for a distinct genetic signature to develop. That kind of pattern is hard to produce if everyone is just passing through in a few centuries. It fits better with small, scattered groups occupying a broad, relatively stable refugium, hunting, gathering, raising children, telling stories during long cold nights, while glaciers to the east and south blocked easy movement into the rest of the Americas. If that's right, then the crossing into a new world wasn't a single heroic march, but more of a slow ecological drift. You live on the western side of a huge plain for generations. Your descendants live nearer the centre. Their descendants live closer to the eastern margin. Nobody in that chain thinks, we are migrating from Asia to America. They're just following herds, responding to climate shifts, exploring river valleys, maybe retreating when conditions worsen, advancing again when they improve. Only when the ice finally recedes and corridors open along the coast, and through the interior does that gradual drift turn into a gateway. But there's another route to think about, one that doesn't rely on an inland passage between towering ice sheets, the coastal route. The Pacific shoreline during the Ice Age was not where the shoreline is today. With sea levels lower, the edge of the continent lay far out from the current beaches, now drowned under cold water. Out there in the space we can't easily excavate lay kelp forests, tidal flats, estuaries, and archipelagos of islands and headlands. An entire kelp highway, as some researchers call it, running from northeastern Asia down the Pacific side of the Americas. Coastlines like that are rich in food if you know how to exploit them. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, edible seaweeds. Populations living along such coasts in Asia already had boats and maritime skills tens of thousands of years ago. It's not a stretch to imagine some of them gradually extending their range along that familiar ecological corridor, leapfrogging from bay to bay, island to island, long before any ice-free inland route existed. The problem is that almost all the good coastal campsites from that era are now underwater. The archaeological record is literally drowned. That doesn't mean they weren't there, it just means they're hard to see. A few tantalizing finds on higher ground, early sites in British Columbia, in Chile, in California, fit more comfortably with a coastal dispersal than with a late opening of an interior passage. But the sample is tiny, and each site comes with its own interpretive arguments. This brings us to timing, and to why the dates keep moving. For much of the 20th century, the story went like this. The big ice sheets retreated enough around 13,000 years ago to open an ice-free corridor through Western Canada. People crossed Beringia, poured through that corridor, and very quickly spread across the continent. The earliest widespread archaeological culture we could see clearly was Clovis, so Clovis became the first Americans. Clean, simple, easy to print in textbooks. Then sites kept appearing that were older than Clovis. First a few that could be dismissed as mistakes, then more that were harder to wave away. Then sites in South America that seemed, if the dates were right, to require people in the Americas before that inland corridor was usable at all. Monte Verde in Chile, Paisley Caves in Oregon, Page Ladson in Florida, Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. Each one had its critics. Each one had its defenders. But as the list grew, something had to give. Now, instead of a single Clovis first script, you're likely to hear a range of estimates. Some researchers are comfortable with people south of the ice sheets by around 15,000 years ago. Others argue for dates a bit earlier. A smaller but insistent minority suggests human presence in parts of the Americas more than 20,000 years ago. Those earlier claims are still under heavy scrutiny, and you will find passionate arguments on all sides. Why does the story shift? Because the evidence is thin, and every new site has to be interpreted carefully. Radiocarbon dates can be contaminated. Natural processes can sometimes break rocks in ways that mimic simple stone tools. Bones can be moved around after burial by animals or water. When we push into the limits of our methods, uncertainties multiply. A single hearth, a few flakes, a fragment of bone with cut marks. These are fragile clues on which to hang continental histories. So rather than a fixed date you can memorize, what we have right now is a window. Sometime between, say, the low 20s and the mid-teens of thousands of years ago, small groups of humans were moving into and through the Americas, by routes that almost certainly included Beringia and very likely included the Pacific coast. The exact choreography who arrived when, in what numbers, along which exact paths is still being worked out. Inside that uncertainty, though, genetics gives us a different kind of clarity. Modern and ancient DNA suggests that most indigenous peoples of the Americas descend from a relatively small set of founding populations that had already mixed and differentiated somewhere in northeastern Asia and Beringia before spreading south. Not one family, not a single band, but not millions either. A limited number of lineages that then had an entire hemisphere in front of them. When small founding populations move into a vast, mostly unoccupied landscape, change can happen quickly. Not just in genes, but in language, in technology, in culture. Imagine a few hundred individuals fanning out into dozens of river valleys, mountain basins, coastal inlets. One group settles in dense forest, another along a rich salmon river, another on high, wind-swept plains. Within a few centuries, the best ways to live in those places start to diverge. Different prey animals, different plant resources, different seasonal rhythms. Children grow up learning slightly different toolkits, slightly different stories, slightly different routes across the land. Genetically, random drift. The chance fluctuations that happen in small populations can make lineages look distinct very fast. Culturally, innovation spreads in some directions and not others. A new spear point style might diffuse along a trade network that hugs a coastline but never reach inland hunters on the plateau. A fishing technique might be vital in one region and irrelevant in another. After 1,000 or 2,000 years of this, the descendants of that original founding set can look and sound and live in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to one another, even though they share deep ancestry. This is one reason we have to be careful with phrases like the first Americans in the singular. Very early on, there were likely multiple groups with slightly different histories and roots, some more coastal, some more interior, some maybe arriving earlier, some later, some meeting and mixing, others diverging in isolation. Our tools for detecting these patterns, radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA, seafloor archaeology, are all improving, but they're still working against enormous losses. Coastlines drowned, campsites eroded, organic materials decayed into nothing. So in this part of the story, we live with a lot of maybe a prolonged stay in Beringia before anything like America even existed as a concept. Maybe an early pulse of coastal voyagers moving surprisingly fast down the Pacific Rim. Maybe interior routes opening and closing as climate flickered. A few points seem solid. There was a northern staging ground. There were small founding populations, and once those populations gained access to the continents south of the Great Ice, they spread and diversified with remarkable speed. Everything else, the precise timing, the mix of routes, the exact number of distinct migration waves, is still a work in progress. And that's not a flaw in the story. It's a reminder that we're listening for faint voices at the very edge of what the Earth is still willing to tell us. Those faint voices will matter when we turn to the first clearly visible culture in the archaeological record, the one that spent most of the 20th century standing in for all early Americans. Because the rise of that culture and the way it has dominated headlines has shaped how people think about disappearance. To understand why, we have to meet Clovis. Clovis, first of all, is a name we gave to a way of making tools. Not a people who called themselves Clovis. Not a single tribe marching across the continent in lockstep. Clovis is an archaeological label for a particular toolkit that shows up in the record around 13,000 years ago and, for a while, seems to be almost everywhere. If you've ever seen a photo of an early American spear point in a museum book, odds are it was Clovis. Long, leaf-shaped, with careful flaking along the edges and a distinctive groove or flute running up from the base on one or both faces. That flute wasn't decoration. It helped thin the base of the point so it could be snugly attached to a spear shaft. To make one of these things you needed skill and practice. The maker had to envision the final shape, choose the right stone, apply force in just the right way and just the right sequence. It's the product of a teaching tradition, not a one-off improvisation. When archaeologists talk about Clovis, they're really talking about this cluster of traits: fluted points, certain kinds of blades and scrapers, a preference for particular raw materials when available, sometimes associated butchering patterns on big animals. It's a technological tradition, a shared habit of making and using things. The people who carried that tradition were real, of course. They had languages, myths, kin networks, favourite campsites, rivalries with their neighbours. But those social worlds don't fossilise directly. What survives in the ground are the hard, durable fragments of their everyday lives. When those fragments line up in consistent patterns across many sites, scattered over huge distances, we give the pattern a name. Clovis is one of those names. For much of the 20th century, that name did a lot of work. Because Clovis was the first culture we could see clearly, with well-dated sites and distinctive tools, it quietly became the stand-in for the first Americans. It fit beautifully with the story of a late opening ice-free corridor and a rapid spread southward. Ice retreats, corridor opens, Clovis appears like a technological comet streaking across the continent. Elegant, simple, headline ready. And like many elegant, simple stories, it turned out to be too tidy. The trouble started when those pre-Clovis sites we talked about earlier refused to go away. If people were already in Chile or Oregon or the eastern United States before 13,000 years ago, then Clovis couldn't be the beginning. It had to be a middle chapter in a much longer book. That realization didn't land all at once. For decades, archaeology conferences had a kind of ritual. Someone would present a site that looked older than Clovis, others would raise concerns about dating or site disturbance, and the status quo would wobble but not quite fall. Yet, as more and more early candidates were re-examined with better methods, and as independent lines of evidence, from genetics, from paleoclimate studies converged, the Clovis first model lost its privileged place. We're now in a very different landscape. Most specialists accept that there were people south of the great ice sheets before Clovis. Some tools exist that look nothing like Clovis points. Some sites have no fluted points at all, but still show clear signs of human activity. In that context, Clovis becomes less like the first and more like the first we saw clearly because it was convenient to see. That convenience matters. Clovis points are big, durable, and distinctive. They show up in a wide range of environments, from the Great Plains to the southeast to parts of the west. They're also associated, at some sites, with the bones of large Ice Age animals: mammoth, mastodon, giant bison. Those dramatic associations make them easier to notice, easier to interpret, easier to talk about in broad strokes. This visibility creates an illusion. If you map the known Clovis finds, you get a constellation that seems to light up much of North America in a surprisingly short period of time, maybe only a few centuries. Then, a couple of thousand years later at most, the classic Clovis form is gone. Later point styles, Folsom, Cumberland, a whole range of regional traditions, take its place. On the maps, it looks like a rapid rise and an equally rapid disappearance. That visual pattern tempts us into a particular kind of story: a sudden continent-wide population expansion, followed by a mysterious continental vanishing. The headlines almost write themselves: Clovis people spread like wildfire, then vanished overnight. It sounds like the kind of thing that ought to have a single dramatic cause: a comet impact, a super eruption, a deadly plague. Something big enough to knock an entire culture off the map. But remember what Clovis actually is: a way of making tools. When a particular spear point style seems to be everywhere for a while and then isn't, there are at least two broad possibilities. One is that the people who used that style disappeared, leaving empty land behind. The other is that the people changed the way they made spear points. From a distance, especially from the very great distance of thousands of years, those two scenarios can look eerily similar in the archaeological record. In both cases, old styles stop appearing in newly deposited layers. In both cases, new styles show up. Without careful site-by-site analysis, it's easy to misread a change in technology as a turnover of people. This is where the idea of cultural turnover becomes important. Cultural turnover doesn't have to mean invasion or replacement. It can in some contexts, but it can also mean that a set of shared habits, how you hunt, what you emphasize in your toolkit, what counts as the right way to do something, gradually gives way to a different set. Maybe because environments change. Maybe because certain prey animals become rarer and others more important. Maybe because neighbouring groups with slightly different techniques become more influential, or because a new teaching lineage emerges that prefers a different flaking strategy. In that sense, Clovis could fade out without any dramatic demographic crash. The descendants of Clovis using groups might still be living in the same valleys, drinking from the same rivers, telling stories in the same languages. But the children and grandchildren of the original flintnappers are learning to make Folsom points, or unfluted lanceolates, or something else entirely. A few centuries later, if you dig a campsite, the only tools you find belong to that newer tradition. Clovis is gone, but only because you've defined it as a very specific style. The problem of headlines is that they hunger for clear beginnings and endings. The Clovis culture appears sounds like an origin. The Clovis culture disappears sounds like an extinction. Both phrases treat a flexible, evolving set of practices as if it were a single organism with a birth certificate and a death date. Reality is messier. Tool traditions overlap in time. In some regions, Clovis-like points and later forms coexist. In others, local experiments branch off earlier. What we're really looking at when we see those maps is a shifting mosaic of groups borrowing, adapting, and sometimes abandoning techniques as conditions change. A disappearance in that mosaic can be an artifact of how we slice the data. Decide that Clovis only covers fluted points of a certain size and shape, and you guarantee that as people tweak their designs, make them narrower for a different hunting strategy, Change the base for easier hafting. Those points will eventually fall outside your definition. At that moment, your category dies, even if no human does. The same thing can happen in reverse. Call every early fluted point Clovis, no matter how it differs regionally, and you flatten a rich diversity into one label. You erase subtle transitions that might tell you how people were responding to local conditions at the end of the Ice Age. For a sleep-time mind, there's something quietly humbling in this. The grand narratives, first arrivals, sudden vanishings, lost peoples, often rest on tiny differences in how we name things, on which edge of a stone we choose to trace with a pencil in a lab. Clovis teaches us to be careful. The question is not just why did they disappear, but what do we mean by they? Are we talking about a specific genetic population? A language family, a hunting strategy, a set of flint-knapping recipes? Each of those can have a different history, and they don't all rise and fall together. When we keep that in mind, the story of early Americans starts to look less like a series of mysterious vanishings and more like an intricate dance of continuity and change. People stay, but tools change, landscapes shift, and with them, the best ways to live. Some names we've given to those patterns, Clovis among them, fade from our charts, not because their makers walked off stage as a unit, but because the patterns themselves flowed into something new. Those flows become even more visible when the Ice Age itself loosens its grip. As the climate warms and the great glaciers retreat, the Americas change in ways no human has ever seen before. Forests advance, grasslands rearrange, coastlines redraw themselves. The big animals that had dominated the landscape start to struggle, and with them, the hunters who once thrust Clovis points into mammoth hide have to make choices about how to adapt. When the last Ice Age began to loosen its hold, it didn't flip off like a light switch. It unravelled. At first, it was just a trend in the background. Slightly warmer summers, slightly shorter winters, the great ice sheets thinning faster than they grew. But over a few thousand years, those small changes added up to something enormous. For people living in the Americas then, it would have felt like the world itself was slowly changing its mind about what kind of place it wanted to be. Ice that had sat heavy on the northern half of the continent for tens of thousands of years began to melt in earnest. Vast walls of glacial ice retreated, exposing raw, scraped clean ground. Where there had been only white and grey, water pooled in meltwater lakes. Rivers swelled with seasonal floods, new wetlands formed. Old channels shifted. In some regions, enormous proglacial lakes built up behind ice dams, and then occasionally burst, sending catastrophic floods roaring across the landscape and carving out new valleys in a geological instant. Plants followed the retreating cold. On the Great Plains, tundra and sparse steppe gave way to richer grasslands. Farther south, open parklands thickened into forests. Stands of spruce and pine crept northward, then were joined and sometimes replaced by oak, maple, birch. In some places, what had been a mostly open hunting country for mammoth and giant bison became patchy woodland, with denser cover and a different seasonal rhythm. In others, coastal areas that once sat far inland, bordering broad exposed shelves, shrank as the sea climbed higher, submerging river mouths and lowlands. If you trace those changes on a map, you can literally watch hunting territories warp and slide under people's feet. A valley that, for generations, had been perfect winter range for big grazing animals might become marshy or close in with brush. A route that once offered an easy seasonal migration between summer and winter camps might be blocked by a new lake or cut by a river that now ran deeper and wilder. Places where caribou, mammoth or giant bison had reliably passed every year might see those herds decline, or shift their paths hundreds of miles away. For foragers whose whole calendar was built around animal movements and plant seasons, that wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a structural change in how to live. You can imagine families sitting around a fire at what used to be a dependable autumn camp, realizing that the herds are late. Then, later. Then never come. Tracks are fewer each year. The snow melts earlier, the river breaks up differently, the berries ripen at a slightly different time. Each of those tiny signals nudges a decision. Do we stay? Do we follow the animals north? Do we turn our attention to different prey, different plants, different waters? Over a handful of generations, those nudges add up to new movement patterns. What had once been a simple back and forth between two favoured regions might become a looping circuit. Groups that rarely saw each other might find themselves crossing paths more often, as everyone experiments with new seasonal rounds. Others, whose territories were once far apart, might now be separated only by a narrow band of forest or a single river. And then there was the sea. As the continental ice melted, all that stored water had to go somewhere. It went back into the oceans. Global sea levels rose, metre by metre, century after century. On a human timescale, that rise was slow enough that a person might not notice it directly. A shoreline creeps inland by a few hand spans in a lifetime. A favourite fishing spot grows a little deeper. A sandbar disappears. But over thousands of years the effect was dramatic. Continental shelves that had once been broad, dry plains became shallow seas. Estuaries pushed upstream, island chains appeared where there had once been continuous coast. Low-lying coastal camps, the kinds of places that are ideal for foragers with flexible diets, rich in shellfish, fish runs, waterfowl, and nearby terrestrial game, would have been steadily flooded and abandoned, their hearths and middens drowned under metres of water. The same sea level rise that swallowed camps also drowned some of the routes that people had used to move between regions. Those late glacial shorelines around the Pacific, for example, where early Americans may have travelled in boats or walked along rich kelp forests, are now largely underwater. Any temporary camps, canoe landings, workshop sites where they sharpened tools on beach cobbles, those are now beneath the waves, beyond the reach of most archaeological methods. The same is true of many coastal plains along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. What looks on our modern maps like a tight margin between ocean and land was, for Ice Age peoples, a much wider, more generous fringe. This drowning of edges helps explain a puzzle that shows up in the archaeological record. In some inland areas, especially where erosion and sedimentation have been kind, we see fairly continuous sequences of sites from the end of the Ice Age into the warming period. Point styles change, prey animals shift, camp layouts evolve, but the record doesn't simply stop. In other regions, especially those that would have been closer to ancient coasts or along now buried river valleys, there are gaps. Dense clusters of early sites give way, in the layers above, to silence. Then, much later, new sites appear again with different tool traditions. From a naive reading, those silences can look like disappearances. People are there, then not, then new people arrive. But when you factor in climate and sea level, a less mysterious story emerges. It's not necessarily that populations vanished as if erased, it's that the places where they were living and the kinds of materials that preserved best shifted beyond where we're currently looking. Forest soils, for example, are often acidic and churned by roots and burrowing animals. They don't preserve bone or fragile artifacts as kindly as dry caves or arid basins do. If people moved into newly forested uplands after deglaciation, their camps might leave only the faintest traces, tiny scatters of stone flakes, hearth stains that blur over time, hard to find under thick vegetation and deep leaf litter. Meanwhile, the lowland floodplains that might have preserved their camp layers in neat stratified packages are now submerged or deeply buried beneath later sediments. In that sense, the archaeological record is not a straightforward census. It's something more like a patchwork quilt, with bright, detailed panels where conditions favoured preservation and discovery, and large blank spaces where people may well have lived, but their traces have been smudged out or hidden. Against this backdrop of shifting forests, moving grasslands, changing rivers, and rising seas, the end of Clovis and the rise of later traditions make a different kind of sense. The people weren't magically different one morning. The world around them was, as mammoth and other big Ice Age animals declined, as dense woods encroached on former open range, as river systems changed their courses, the cost-benefit balance of certain tools and techniques shifted too. A massive, all-purpose mammoth spear point isn't necessarily the best choice for hunting smaller, quicker game in broken terrain, or for fishing more often, or for relying more heavily on plant foods and small animals. So groups experimented over generations. Some of those experiments stuck. New point forms, lighter and more specialized. More emphasis on traps, nets and snares that don't fossilize as readily as stone. Different patterns of storage and mobility. Maybe more caching of tools along a familiar route. Maybe more permanent or semi-permanent use of especially rich locations. From the vantage point of thousands of years later, that adaptive dance can easily be mistaken for disappearance. One toolkit goes out of fashion as another becomes dominant. Certain regions go quiet in the record just as others come into focus. But underneath those shifting patterns, what we're really seeing is continuity expressed through change. Families teaching children new techniques for new conditions, knowledge being reworked but not erased, lineages bending rather than breaking as the Ice Age gives way to a very different world. The first Americans didn't simply vanish when the climate warmed. They moved, they adapted, they followed new rivers and shorelines, learned new forests, adjusted their hunting and gathering calendars to fit a landscape in motion. Their story after the Ice Age is not one of abrupt endings, but of retuning their lives to a planet that was, quite literally, reshaping itself around them. For a long time, the American landscape had been dominated by giants. Mammoths and mastodons, towering camel and horse species, ground sloths the size of small trucks, beavers as big as black bears, lions, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. It was a world where much of the available meat walked around in packages weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds, and where a successful hunt could feed a community for weeks. By the time the Ice Age was unspooling, that world was breaking apart. Across North and South America, the largest animals were thinning out. Not everywhere at once, not in a single dramatic crash, but in a patchy, region-by-region unravelling that played out over several thousand years. In some places, mammoths disappear from the bone record while mastodons linger. In others, giant ground sloths hang on after horses and camels are gone. The pattern is complex, messy, and still actively debated. Why those giants vanished is one of the biggest questions in American prehistory, and there isn't yet a single answer everyone agrees on. One family of explanations points to climate. As the ice sheets retreated and habitats shifted, the wide, open, cold-adapted grasslands that supported herds of mammoth and giant bison shrank or fragmented. Forests spread, wetlands thickened, vegetation patterns changed. A landscape that had been ideal for big, roaming grazers became more mosaic, more patchy. For animals that needed huge territories and enormous amounts of food, even subtle changes in plant communities could add up to trouble. Another family of explanations focuses on people. By the time many of these extinctions were unfolding, humans were present almost everywhere those animals lived. Some researchers argue that efficient hunters, armed with refined stone points, working in coordinated groups, could have imposed enough extra mortality on slow reproducing species to tip them into decline. Not because every mammoth was hunted down, but because taking just a few extra adults per generation, especially breeding females, can push a population already stressed by climate change past a breaking point. And then there's the possibility that it wasn't climate or people alone, but the combination that mattered most. A warming world might have put those megafauna under pressure, thinning their numbers and concentrating them in certain refuges. Human hunters might then have focused on those same refuges, following predictable migrations, taking advantage of animals whose behaviour had been shaped by Ice Age conditions, no longer quite matched to their surroundings. In that double bind, even modest hunting could have outsized effects on animals already living closer to the edge. Layered over all of this are more speculative ideas. Disease sweeping through naive animal populations, for example, but the evidence there is much thinner. For now, most researchers see some interplay of climate shifts and human hunting as the most likely drivers. How much of the blame to assign each is still an open, technical argument, and probably always will be. Whatever the exact cause, the effect on human lives would have been immediate and intimate. If your yearly round depended on intercepting mammoth herds at a particular pass, or returning to a favoured valley where mastodons had always browsed in the spring, the sudden thinning or disappearance of those animals would force hard choices. Losing big game isn't just losing meat. It's losing hides for clothing and shelter, bones and tusks for tools, tendons for binding, fat for fuel and calories through lean seasons. Technology bends quickly under those pressures. The heavy, carefully shaped spear points associated with big game hunting make sense when your primary targets are massive animals in open ground. They're overbuilt on purpose, tough enough to punch deep through thick hide, bone, and muscle, sometimes even designed to break in a controlled way inside the animal to maximize damage. They're also costly. Each point takes time, skill, and good raw stone to produce. As mammoths and their kin dwindled, those costs would have started to look different. If most of your hunting opportunities now involve smaller, quicker animals, deer, antelope, caribou, rabbits, waterfowl, or fish running in rivers, it can make more sense to shift toward lighter, more numerous points. Projectile tips optimized for penetration without needing to withstand the same intense impact forces. Barbed harpoons for fish, tiny microliths inset into bone or wooden shafts. Tools you can afford to lose because each individual piece is cheaper to make. Along with those design shifts, whole toolkits begin to diversify. You see more emphasis on scrapers and cutting tools suited to processing plants and smaller hides. Grinding stones and mortars appear in greater numbers in some regions, signalling more intensive use of seeds, nuts, and roots. Bone needles point to more tailored clothing, perhaps needed in climates where big animal hides were less easily obtained. Nets, snares, basketry, and fish weirs, mostly invisible in the archaeological record, unless conditions are extraordinarily kind, almost certainly began to play a larger role. Mobility patterns bend too. Large game on open steppe encourages a wide-ranging, highly mobile lifestyle. Camps might move frequently to follow herds with short stays and light footprints. When diets shift toward a broader mix of smaller animals, fish and plants, it can become more efficient to anchor yourself to a handful of especially rich spots and radiate out from them. Salmon rivers, lakes with waterfowl and fish, ecotones where forest meets open country, oak-rich hillsides with reliable acorn crops, these kinds of places invite repeated, seasonal use. People might start caching tools and raw materials there, returning year after year. Some families may spend longer parts of the calendar in one region, only making shorter excursions rather than continent-spanning migrations. Archaeologists call this move toward using a wide variety of foods broad-spectrum foraging. Instead of orienting your whole lifestyle around a few spectacular animals, you spread your bets. Deer and smaller ungulates when they're available, birds and their eggs during nesting seasons, turtles and fish as river levels allow, shellfish where coasts make that possible, seeds, tubers, bulbs, berries, nuts, inner bark and greens, timed carefully to local calendars. It's a strategy that often increases resilience. If one resource fails in a particular year, say a drought knocks back a berry crop, others may still be available. But from the perspective of future researchers, it's a strategy that can leave lighter, more ambiguous traces. Big game kill sites are dramatic. A mammoth or mastodon bone bed with stone points embedded in ribs, cut marks on leg bones, and heaps of broken stone nearby is hard to miss when erosion opens it up. You can stand at such a site and feel the intensity of a single, major event. Broad-spectrum foraging leaves a different kind of footprint. Instead of a few enormous, spectacular camps, you may get dozens or hundreds of small, seasonally used spots, a scatter of flakes where someone paused to resharpen a blade while fishing, a few burned rock clusters from roasting plants, a thin layer of small bones, many of which don't preserve well. In forested or wet environments, where organic materials decay quickly and soils churn, those traces blur and disappear far more easily than a mammoth skeleton in dry sediment. Over centuries and millennia, that difference in visibility can erase earlier signatures. Looking down through the layers, a researcher might see a cluster of large kill and butchery sites with heavy spear points, then, above them, far fewer obvious camps of any kind. It's easy to be tempted into thinking the people themselves diminished or vanished. But another reading is that they didn't go anywhere. They just stopped leaving the kinds of sites we're best at finding. Instead of one big kill a year, they might have been making 100 small ones. Instead of basing their economies on bones that fossilize well, they might have leaned more on plants, fish, and small creatures whose remains dissolve silently into the soil. Instead of toolkits dominated by large stone points, they may have relied more heavily on wood, fibre, and bone, materials that in most environments rot away without a trace. In that sense, adaptation can masquerade as disappearance. A toolkit goes out of fashion because the animals it was built for are no longer the backbone of the diet. Mobility patterns tighten around rivers, lakes, and plant-rich uplands that don't preserve sites as cleanly as arid plains. People invest more in knowledge of local ecologies when the salmon run, where the roots are sweetest after frost, than in the spectacular high-risk hunts that leave thick archaeological signatures. From the far future looking back, the story shrinks on our maps. Point styles change, the big bone beds cease, and it can seem as if a once vibrant population has simply thinned into nothing. But if you shift your perspective from the most visible sites to the most plausible lives, a quieter image emerges. Families who once tracked mammoths across open steppe, now teaching their children the timing of acorn leaching, the construction of efficient fish traps, the best ways to smoke meat from smaller animals so it lasts through winter. Hunters who once staked their fortunes on a few enormous, dangerous animals now spreading risk across dozens of smaller, predictable ones. The first Americans didn't just lose their giants. They replaced them with knowledge, with flexibility, with new relationships to the land. In doing so, they stepped onto a pathway that would eventually lead from scattered camps to more rooted communities, and from foraging alone toward the first experiments with tending, managing, and finally cultivating the plants that had sustained them for so long. As those new subsistence strategies settled in, something else began to shift, slowly, unevenly, but in a way that would eventually reshape whole regions. When more of your calories come from places that are predictably rich, river confluences, shell-packed estuaries, lake shores, floodplains, oak groves, you have a reason to keep circling back to them. At first, that might just mean visiting the same camp spots in a regular yearly round. But over generations, repetition changes the relationship. A bend in the river stops being just a good fishing place and starts being your fishing place. The marsh where your grandparents always dug tubers is where you teach your own children to dig. You know which sandbar will be exposed in a dry summer, which back channel holds fish after floods. Knowledge layers in place, and place layers into identity. That's the soil from which more permanent communities grow. Population growth adds pressure to this process. As people spread into more valleys, more coasts, more interior basins, empty spaces shrink. A band that once had an entire drainage, mostly to itself, now has neighbours upstream and downstream. The best salmon riffles, the most reliable nut groves, the calmest shellfish beds in a storm, those become worth negotiating over, maybe even fighting over. Under those conditions, it can be an advantage to settle more firmly. If your group invests in building substantial houses that can weather winter, if you maintain storage pits, smokehouses, racks and fish weirs, if you plant or at least encourage favoured plants near camp, you're not just living off a place, you're modifying it. You're turning a seasonal camp into a semi-sedentary hub, a place you anchor your year around. Archaeologists can sometimes see this transition in the dirt. Instead of thin scatters of stone flakes and a few fire-cracked rocks, you start to find thicker cultural layers. Repeated hearths built in the same spots, post holes from structures that were rebuilt over and over, dense middens full of shells, bones, and broken tools. In some coastal regions of the Americas, these middens pile up into mounds many meters high, literal hills made of the leftovers of meals, the debris of daily life, accumulating over centuries. To live like that, you don't have to give up mobility entirely. Many early communities seem to have combined a stable base with radiating seasonal trips. Some family members might stay by the river camp to tend drying fish and watch cached tools, while others travel into the hills after game, or up tributaries to gather berries and roots. The base, though, gives everyone a shared reference point, a place to return to, a place to leave grandparents and small children when the hunting trip runs long. As more people cluster around those hubs, societies begin to differentiate internally. Certain families might gain status as the ones who control key fishing spots or who hold knowledge of when floods will hit. Skilled craft workers, healers, storytellers, and ritual specialists may be supported by the labour of others. Leadership positions start to be recognised, even if they're still fluid and tied to personal charisma or generosity, rather than formal offices. With more people in closer contact, you also get more room for specialisation between regions. Imagine a broad river system feeding into a coastal plain. Communities near the headwaters might focus on big game and upland plants, trading hides, meat and stone for the fish, salt and shell beads produced downstream. Groups near obsidian outcrops or fine chert quarries become known as the sources for high-quality stone. Coastal people become shellfish experts and skilled navigators, carrying news and goods along the shore. Over time, these economic differences harden into cultural ones. Dialect variations thicken into distinct languages. Decorative styles on pottery, clothing, or carved bone become visual markers of who you are and where you're from. Myths and origin stories root specific groups to specific landscapes. This hill where the first ancestors emerged, that lake where the world was remade. Population growth doesn't just multiply people, it multiplies possible identities. This is one of the reasons the idea of the first Americans as a single unified culture gradually stops making sense. 10,000 years after the first human footprints reached the far south of the continents, you're not dealing with one population fanning out along ice-edge corridors. You're looking at dozens, then hundreds of regional traditions, each with its own way of living in its own patch of land. And with that regionalisation come new kinds of monuments. They don't start as grand, towering statements. Often they begin as modest earthworks, low mounds marking burials, rings of post holes that may have held wooden structures, shallow ditches that could have had defensive, ritual, or purely practical purposes. In some North American river valleys, early mound complexes appear thousands of years before agriculture becomes dominant, suggesting that people were coming together for reasons beyond immediate subsistence needs. To raise even a small mound, you need organisation. Someone has to decide where it goes. People have to agree to carry basket after basket of soil from one place to another, often in a short window of time. Food must be gathered or supplied to sustain those workers. Rituals or ceremonies might mark the beginning and completion of the work. The finished shape then stands as a physical anchor for memory. Here is where so-and-so was buried. Here is where we met for the big feast. Here is where we mark the turning of seasons. Monuments can also be routes, linear earthworks, alignments of posts or stones, and carefully cleared pathways may have guided processions between ritual sites or marked the boundaries between territories. Over generations, those paths and markers become part of a cultural map shared by many communities, some of whom may only meet in large numbers at certain times of year, for trade fairs, marriage exchanges, or ceremonial gatherings. Long-distance exchange intensifies in this setting. When communities are more anchored, it becomes easier to predict where your trading partners will be at any given season. People can plan journeys knowing that the obsidian nappers upriver will be at their big riverside village in late summer, or that the coastal shell workers will host a feast after the autumn storms. Objects begin to travel astonishing distances. Particular stone types, marine shells, copper pigments, and shaped ornaments show up hundreds or even thousands of miles from their sources. Those trade routes don't just move things, they move ideas. Techniques for building houses, shaping tools, weaving baskets, or brewing medicines can pass along the same networks as beads and blades. Rituals, songs, and stories diffuse as travellers share nights around distant hearths. Myths picked up in one valley may be reshaped and retold in another, stitched into local histories, tied to local landmarks. From an archaeological perspective, this shift from scattered camps to more anchored communities creates a paradox. On one hand, larger semi-permanent settlements and monumental earthworks are much easier to find than ephemeral hunting camps. A village that stood for centuries can leave thick layers of debris. A mound can survive ploughing, flooding, and forest growth. Exchange networks can sometimes be traced through changes in material style, letting researchers follow the paths of trade like faint lines on an ancient map. On the other hand, the very success of those communities can erase their own precursors. If an earthwork complex is built on a favoured terrace that's been used as a camp for thousands of years, earlier layers may be disturbed, reworked, or buried under later construction. House floors overlie older fire pits, new burials cut through old ones. When you dig down, the neat sequence you might expect, simple hunter-gatherer camps, then semi-sedentary hamlets, then villages with monuments, may instead appear as a confused tangle. And many communities that made the leap toward more complex organization did so using materials that rarely last. Wooden posts, woven mats, brush structures plastered with mud, fences, corrals, platforms, and elaborate ritual architecture built from organic materials can all vanish without a trace in a few thousand years, especially in humid or heavily vegetated environments. What's left might be a faint discoloration in the soil, a few burned patches, subtle chemical signatures invisible without modern techniques. From a distance of millennia, that can look like disappearance. In one river basin, you may see evidence of large, complex mound-building societies at a certain time depth, and then, in layers above, fewer or different kinds of monumental structures. Pottery styles shift, housing patterns change, key trade goods stop showing up. It is tempting to label that as collapse or replacement, or the vanishing of a people. But another way to read it is as transformation. Communities that once expressed their identity through big earthen monuments might shift towards smaller, more household-based rituals. Trade routes might reorient, turning away from one prestigious centre to favour another. Populations might migrate a few valleys over, blend with neighbours, or reorganise politically. The people in those later layers may be descended directly from the mound builders below, They just no longer invest in the same visible forms of architecture. In that light, many lost or vanished groups stop being mysteries and start being continuities in disguise. Names change, material styles evolve, alliances form, fracture and reform. A community known in the archaeological record for a particular kind of pottery or a distinctive type of mound may, over a few centuries, become the ancestors of a group recognized historically under a completely different name, speaking a different dialect, participating in different trade networks. From our vantage point, peering backward through a keyhole of incomplete evidence, it's easy to draw a line from dramatic sites to nothing, and imagine that whole peoples blinked out of existence. But if we remember that camps grow into communities, that communities can merge, split, and rebrand themselves without anyone disappearing biologically, the story softens. What looks like an ending in one kind of evidence may be a bend in the road in another. The first Americans did not live static lives in unchanging bands. Their descendants built villages, wove trade networks, raised monuments, and crafted identities as intricate as any that would come later. When those patterns shift in the record, we are often watching evolution, not extinction. And in the next chapter of their story, those evolving communities would take another step that would further deepen their ties to particular places. The earliest experiments with farming, and the slow, world-changing realization that you could not only gather plants, but also guide and eventually reshape their lives. Those earliest experiments didn't look anything like the neat rows and geometric fields we picture when we hear the word farm. They began as tweaks. You notice that the biggest, fattest seeds in a patch of wild grass tend to grow from plants on the edges, where the soil is a little deeper. You start preferentially picking those seeds. Maybe you spill some in the soft dirt near your camp. Next year, the plants right by camp seem a little denser, a little easier to harvest. You talk about it. You remember it. You do it again. That sort of gentle steering seems to have happened independently in many parts of the Americas. In what is now central Mexico and the Balsas River basin further south, people had long harvested wild teosinte, a scruffy grass with small, hard kernels. Over generations, by choosing plants with slightly larger seeds, slightly looser casings, they nudged it into something new, early maize. Somewhere in that same broad region, squash and beans were also being tended, selected and shaped. Together they formed a trio, the famous three sisters that would eventually feed millions. Far to the south, along the tropical lowlands and Andean foothills, other plants were being recruited into closer partnership. Manioc and sweet potato, chili peppers and peanuts, early varieties of cotton and gourds, all were pulled into emerging horticultural systems. In the high Andes, people were slowly domesticating potatoes and quinoa, learning which strains tolerated frost, which stored well, which tasted best after patient roasting. North of the Great Tropical Belt, in the river valleys and wetlands of eastern North America, a different cast of plants stepped onto the stage. People there had long gathered seeds from native grasses, knotweed, little barley, sumpweed and sunflower. Over time, some of these species show clear signs of domestication. Larger seeds, thinner seed coats, clustered growth. Before maize ever arrived from the south, an independent eastern agricultural complex had begun to take shape. None of these developments had a clear start date. They were long, overlapping processes of noticing, favouring and remembering. For a very long time, people who were farming in this sense were also still hunting, fishing and gathering on a large scale. Fields, gardens and tended patches were just one more layer in a flexible subsistence web. But the plants were changing, and so were the people. Domesticated crops trade wild toughness for human protection. A wild grass might scatter its seeds before you arrive. A domesticated one holds on to them until harvest. A wild squash might be bitter and armoured with a hard shell. A tended variety becomes sweeter, fleshier, easier to cut. In exchange, those plants become more dependent on you. They thrive where you clear competing vegetation, where you loosen soil, where you chase away seed-eating birds. When that relationship deepens, your calendar starts to revolve around plant lives. You still move, but you move with constraints. Someone has to be near the maize when it's vulnerable. Someone has to weed the squash mounds. Someone has to dig the manioc at the right season, or watch for frosts that could kill young potato shoots. Camps that were once places you visited because animals happened to pass nearby become places you must visit because the plants are there. Storage amplifies all of this. If you can take a season of plenty, ripe grain, full granaries of maize, baskets of dried tubers, and stretch it across the lean months, you smooth out risk. Pit houses and above-ground granaries, baskets sealed with pitch, gourds stuffed with dried seeds. All of these become time machines, carrying calories from one season into the next. But stored food is also visible wealth. It can be guarded, shared, controlled. Households that manage to produce and protect surplus can host bigger feasts, support more dependents, and weather bad years with less suffering. Over generations that can translate into social differences, lineages known for abundance, families associated with particular fields, leaders who arbitrate access to irrigation or planting grounds. Health shifts too in complicated ways. A diet anchored in starchy crops can provide a steady baseline of calories, lowering the constant threat of outright starvation. Larger, more stable populations become possible. At the same time, relying heavily on a few plants can narrow nutritional diversity. Bone chemistry and skeletal remains from some early farming communities show signs of increased workload stress, dental problems, and periodic malnutrition, even as numbers grow. From the vantage point of foraging neighbours looking in, farming communities could be both attractive and dangerous. On one hand, they might offer food in bad years, host large ceremonies, and produce desirable goods, textiles from domesticated cotton, special foods from distant crops. On the other hand, their fields required defended space, clearing land, building terraces, managing irrigation. All of that created fixed claims on particular plots. When farming systems expanded, they did not always do so gently. Sometimes, small groups of horticulturalists moved into new valleys, bringing seeds, knowledge, and a new pattern of life with them. Foraging groups encountering them could respond in several ways. They might adopt key crops themselves, gradually shifting their own seasonal rounds to incorporate gardens. They might intermarry, blending lifeways and creating communities that hunted intensely in some seasons and farmed in others. Or they might be pushed aside, squeezed into less fertile zones as fields spread along floodplains and lake shores. This process, expansion, adoption, blending, displacement, rarely took the form of one neat wave of farmers entirely replacing foragers. It was more often a patchwork. In one valley, foragers might become farmers. In the next, foragers might hold on to older patterns for centuries, trading wild foods for cultivated ones from neighbours. In some places, it might look like a kind of cultural osmosis. Words for crops, tools, and rituals associated with planting spreading from language to language faster than people physically move. That's an important piece of the mystery of disappearance. Ideas can travel without mass migration. A group can shift from hunting-focused to garden-anchored within a few generations simply by copying successful neighbours, marrying in a few specialist farmers, and embracing new rituals around sowing and harvest. Their DNA might remain largely continuous with the people who had lived there for millennia, but their material culture, the tools they use, the houses they build, the foods they leave in the archaeological record can change dramatically. To an archaeologist digging thousands of years later, that can look like the arrival of a new people. Pottery styles change. Plant remains in hearths and middens shift from wild seeds to domesticated grains. House plans reorient to face fields or canals. Words in descendant languages point back to distant homelands for key crops. It is tempting to map all of that onto the movement of entirely new populations and the disappearance of those who came before. In reality, the story may be subtler. Some earlier groups were no doubt displaced or absorbed during farming expansions, their territories taken over, their names and languages fading from use. But others persisted inside the new systems as lineages remembered in myth, as clans known for particular wildcraft skills, as communities who farmed a little and foraged a lot. Agriculture, in that sense, doesn't just create new foods. It creates new ways for people to be related. You can be the maize people of one valley and the river people of another, yet share ancestors. You can speak a language that carries crop names from far away, while your genetic roots lie mostly in the local ground. When those identities and foodways rearrange, earlier configurations vanish from view, even when the descendants are still very much present. As the first farmers of the Americas deepened their partnerships with plants, they were also deepening their ties to place and to each other. The stage was being set for the next layer of complexity, migrations and fusions on a continental scale, where language, genes and culture would braid and unbraid in ways that make simple stories of disappearance even harder to tell. Move forward a few hundred years, or 1,000. The exact number doesn't matter, because the change is slow enough that no single person would ever see it as change at all. In one generation, a young woman from an upland hunting community marries into a riverside farming village. Her brothers come to visit each autumn, bringing dried meat and obsidian blades to trade for maize flour and squash seeds. Children grow up hearing two languages, tasting two cuisines, learning to stalk deer and weed gardens. 2 valleys over, a small group from that same village splits off. Maybe there's a family dispute. Maybe fields are getting crowded. They drift downstream, settle near a marsh, clear a new patch of land, and plant the same crops, but with a few tweaks to fit local soils and floods. Their pottery takes on slightly different shapes. Their stories emphasize different ancestors. None of this feels like a migration event. There are no banners, no armies, no single dramatic moment. But repeat those small movements, marriages and splintering century after century, and a region can be quietly remade. When we think about people moving across the Americas, it's easy to picture big, sweeping arrows on a map. This culture zone pushes into that one. These people replace those people. The reality was usually more granular. Families shifted winter camps to be closer to in-laws. Trading partners decided to stay after a successful season. Refugees from a bad harvest or a local conflict were taken in as guests, then as relatives. Over time, what had been an outside accent becomes just one of the ways the local language is spoken. What had been a foreign tool or recipe becomes normal. Intermarriage lies at the heart of this process. Unlike conquest, which aims to draw a bright line between us and them, marriage is about crossing lines. A woman might leave her birth community to join her partner's people, but bring songs, plant lore, and kin obligations with her. A man might be adopted into his spouse's clan and take on their name, their rituals, their responsibilities. Alliance networks grow out of those ties. 2 villages that exchange spouses also exchange obligations. You're expected to come help if their fields flood, if enemies threaten, if a chief dies and a new one must be installed. Over wide areas, these webs of obligation can bind together communities that speak different languages and follow different subsistence patterns. A foraging band might be in-law to a farming town. A coastal fishing village might be bound by marriage to highland pastoralists. Adoption extends that flexibility even further across the Americas. Many societies later recorded practices of adopting captives, orphans, or visitors into existing clans. A newcomer could become, in every social sense, one of the people, even if their grandparents had spoken an entirely different tongue. Their genetic ancestry might diverge from the group's average, but their social identity would not. When archaeologists look back across these landscapes, what they see most often are not bones and DNA, but things: pots, tools, ornaments, building styles. Ceramic designs shift. A region that once favoured thick, plain jars for storage starts producing thinner bowls with painted spirals. Projectile points change from leaf-shaped to triangular. Grinding stones become more common or disappear. To us, thousands of years later, those changes stand out like sharp boundaries. Before this layer, one style. After this layer, another. It is tempting to read that as population replacement. A new people arrives, an old people vanishes. Sometimes that really does happen. There were likely episodes where groups moved into territories whose previous inhabitants had been weakened by disease, drought, or conflict, taking over fields, renaming rivers, burying their own dead atop older settlements. But new styles do not automatically mean new genes. Ceramics can spread the way fashions do. One influential community starts decorating pots with a particular motif, say, a stylized water bird. Their vessels are admired at regional gatherings, traded along river routes, imitated by neighbouring villages. Within a couple of generations, that motif is everywhere, carried by hands that belong to people whose ancestors never left the valley. The same is true for tools. A clever innovation, a more efficient hoe, a different arrowhead flint knapping sequence, a new way of lashing blades to handles can travel through apprenticeship networks and inter-community friendships. A young person might go live for a season with an uncle in another village, learn a new craft and bring it home. Over time, the tool assemblage in their home region looks new, even though the population is strongly continuous. What's really changing, beneath those material shifts, is identity. Anthropologists use a word for the process by which new peoples form from older, overlapping communities: ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis isn't a single event. It's more like a long, slow coalescence. Picture several neighbouring groups who share a broad language family but have distinct names for themselves, distinct local rituals, distinct favourite foods. For centuries they might think of each other as separate: the people of the river, the people of the hills, the people of the reeds. Then pressures from outside begin to mount. Maybe a powerful trading centre rises to the north, treating all these local groups as one unit when it comes to commerce. Maybe distant enemies arrive, and suddenly we need a broader label to contrast with them. Maybe a shared religious cult spreads, tying multiple villages into one ceremonial circuit. Over a few generations, those formerly separate identities can start to fuse. New origin stories emerge, tracing everyone back to a single founding ancestor or a common sacred place. Old village names become clan names within a larger people. Dialect differences are reinterpreted as internal variation within one language. Outsiders now look at this region and see one tribe, one nation, one culture. From the inside, that new identity feels deep and ancient. But its current form might be only a few hundred years old. The reverse can also happen. A previously unified people can fragment under the strain of internal conflict, environmental stress, or migration. Factions move away, emphasize different ancestors, adopt different neighbours' customs. Given enough time, what began as a political split can harden into a sense of being fundamentally different peoples. Across the Americas, before written records, these cycles of merging and splitting, adopting and redefining were likely constant. A group that archaeologists later name after a pottery style might, in lived reality, have been a patchwork of lineages with diverse histories. A culture area on a map might hide dozens of ongoing processes of ethnogenesis, some identities forming, others dissolving, many blurring into one another at the edges. That's why talking about the disappearance of the first Americans is so tricky. On a timescale of millennia, identity is not a fixed label glued onto a static population. It's a moving pattern negotiated generation by generation. People adopt new foods, new tools, new neighbours, new names for themselves. They repurpose old stories to fit new landscapes. They remember some ancestors and quietly forget others. From a distance of 10 or 12,000 years, a shift from one set of ceramics and house types to another can look like a clean break, an ending. Up close, in the slow motion of lived lives, it may have been something else. Gradual migrations, interwoven families, alliances and adoptions, and the steady work of creating new us out of many different them. As we move deeper into the story, into periods when the archaeological record suddenly changes or goes strangely quiet, keeping that in mind will matter. What looks, on the surface, like disappearance may in fact be transformation, identity shedding one skin and growing another, while the people themselves walk on. From here, the story does something unsettling. In some regions, the ground keeps talking to us. Layer after layer, century after century, we find hearths, storage pits, broken tools, seeds, bones. The sequence is dense, almost like reading a long, continuous diary. We can trace slow changes in diet, in house styles, in trade connections. In other regions, that diary suddenly has missing chapters. An ancient village with deep, well-defined layers simply stops appearing in the record. Above it, instead of more floors and more fire pits, there is clean sediment or a different kind of soil, or nothing at all that looks human. A tool type that had been common over thousands of square miles vanishes from later deposits. A ceremonial tradition traced through carefully aligned mounds ends, with no obvious successor on that exact spot. On maps in archaeology books, those gaps are often shaded in grey. On timelines, they show up as blank spaces between coloured bars. It's easy to look at those blank spaces and feel a chill. Did people die out? Did they abandon entire regions? Did whole cultures simply cease to exist? Before we jump to disappearance, we have to think about something less dramatic but equally powerful. What survives and what does not? Most of what makes up a human life is made of things that decay. Skin, hair, clothing, wooden posts, woven mats, thatched roofs, baskets, leather straps, nets. Even bones, if the soil is acidic enough, can dissolve away until there is nothing left but a faint discoloration. In some environments, preservation is kind. Dry caves, waterlogged bogs, permafrost, desert rock shelters. These can entomb delicate objects for thousands of years. Plant fibers, feathers, pigments, even bits of food residue stuck to cooking pots. In others, preservation is ruthless. Open, humid forests, floodplains where rivers chew through their banks, windy ridges where soil is thin. In those places, 100 years can be enough to erase almost every physical trace of a camp or a village. Fire complicates things further. A house burns and its roof, bedding and wooden frame vanish in ash. But the collapse of roof beams can also bury a floor under a protective layer of burned debris, sealing in tools and seeds and bones. Wildfires can strip topsoil, exposing older layers to erosion, or seal them under charcoal, creating a sharp line in the stratigraphy. Even the way people choose to build and discard matters. A community that digs deep storage pits and uses heavy stone mortars will leave a different archaeological fingerprint than a community that prefers above-ground baskets and light wooden pestles. Both can be equally populous and sophisticated. One will show up in the ground more readily than the other, so when the record seems to go quiet, sometimes it is simply because the quiet parts of life, the flexible organic parts, have vanished back into the earth. Then there is the movement of the landscape itself. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Shorelines stretched far out from the present coasts. River mouths lay on continental shelves that are now drowned. Estuaries and marshes, prime locations for human settlement, have been underwater for thousands of years. Any camps, villages, or ceremonial sites that once existed on those vanished shorelines now lie under meters of seawater and sediment. We know they must have been there because humans love edges where river meets sea, where fresh water meets salt, where fish, shellfish, birds, and plants all gather. But for now, most of those sites are effectively invisible. Rivers, too, do not stay put. Over centuries, big rivers can shift course again and again, leaving old channels as oxbow lakes or buried under new floodplains. A town that once sat on a stable terrace might, 1,000 years later, be under 10 meters of silt, or eroded away entirely by a migrating channel. Erosion cuts and buries in unpredictable ways. Hill slopes slump, gullies deepen, landslides carry whole chunks of ancient ground downhill. Some sites are destroyed, others are sealed and hidden. To us, on the surface, the pattern can look like sudden absence. In reality, the evidence has simply been shuffled into harder-to-reach layers. On top of these natural processes, there is a human filter, where archaeologists can and cannot look. Some regions of the Americas have been intensively surveyed. Ploughed fields turn up artifacts, road cuts expose buried layers, construction projects trigger rescue excavations. Museums and universities in those areas have deep collections, and the maps of sites are crowded. Others are under-surveyed for many reasons. Thick rainforest can hide mounds and causeways under centuries of leaf litter. Mountain regions with few roads can make fieldwork physically difficult. Swamps, tundra and high deserts all pose their own challenges for travel and excavation. There are also political and ethical boundaries. Some lands are protected for good reason. Sacred sites, burial grounds, places where descendant communities have said clearly that they do not want digging. Other areas lie within modern nations where funding for archaeology is limited, or where conflict and instability make long projects unsafe. This uneven attention means some areas appear rich in evidence and continuous in time, not necessarily because they were more populated, but because we have been able and permitted to look there more often and more carefully. Even where we do find sites, our tools shape what we see. Radiocarbon dating, for example, works best on certain materials: charcoal, bone collagen, seeds, wood. If those are scarce or contaminated, our dates can be blurry or missing. Early excavations, done before modern methods, might have saved beautiful artifacts, but discarded the animal bones and plant remains we now rely on for precise dating and dietary reconstruction. Sampling decisions matter too. An archaeologist cannot sieve every grain of soil from an entire valley. They have to choose test pits, trenches, and samples. If a thin, short-lived occupation lies between two thicker layers, it can easily be missed, especially if it left few heavy artifacts. 100 years of intermittent use might register as a faint stain, then be troweled away. On a regional scale, these small decisions and limitations can line up to produce apparent gaps of centuries or millennia where we simply lack dated sites. Those gaps might reflect real declines in population. They might just as well reflect the accident of where we have dug, what we have dated, and what happened to preserve or erase. This is why claims that a people suddenly disappeared deserve careful scrutiny. Sometimes there really are abrupt changes in the record. A city burned and abandoned, a style of pottery that stops everywhere at once, a ritual complex with no later renovation. Catastrophic events, droughts, epidemics, invasions can and did strike. But an abrupt change in our evidence is not always the same thing as an abrupt change in people's lives. Communities can move a few kilometers to higher ground, leaving behind a flood-prone site that later erodes away. Families can shift from heavy, fire-using architecture to lighter, more mobile structures that leave subtler traces. Identities can change names and alliances without leaving a tidy, obvious boundary in the soil. From far away in time, merged with all the accidents of preservation, those gradual adaptations can look like disappearance. As we follow the story of the first Americans into periods where the archaeological record thins out, remembering these filters matters. The ground speaks in a quiet, selective voice. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it falls silent not because no one was there, but because everything they built and believed has, for now, slipped beyond our reach. In that silence, it is tempting to imagine endings. It may be more faithful to the people themselves, to imagine continuities we simply cannot yet see. Once we let go of the idea that nothing in the record automatically means no one was there, another set of questions comes into focus. If people were still living in these landscapes, if communities were shifting and rebuilding in ways that sometimes leave only faint traces, what was driving those shifts? One powerful force, again and again in human history, is simple: stress. Not the constant cinematic violence of a war movie, but the slower tightening of margins. A few bad harvests in a row, game herds moving away, fish runs that no longer arrive on schedule, trade partners whose own troubles ripple outward. When food and security are plentiful, neighbouring groups can afford to be generous. Sharing hunting grounds, hosting feasts, marrying across boundaries, building alliances. When resources tighten, that generosity becomes harder to sustain. We see hints of this kind of stress in the archaeological record of the Americas. In some regions and periods, skeletons show higher rates of healed fractures that look suspiciously like blows, or embedded stone points in ribs and vertebrae. Not common enough to suggest endless warfare, but frequent enough to say interpersonal violence was part of life. In some village sites, later layers show palisades, rows of posts forming defensive walls where earlier layers did not. Entrances become narrower and more easily defended. Houses are clustered more tightly, or moved to hilltops and bluffs with commanding views of the surrounding land. These are the kinds of changes that often accompany rising tension. But they do not by themselves tell us a clear story. A wooden palisade might mean fear of human enemies. It might also mean fear of dangerous animals, or a desire to mark off sacred space, or a response to some specific episode we will never know about. A skeleton with a head injury might be the victim of a raid or of a fall, a hunting accident, or a ritualized combat whose rules we cannot see. Archaeologists tread carefully here. They can count trauma on bones, map fortifications, and note shifts in settlement patterns. They can say violence increased relative to earlier times, or people invested more in defense. But they cannot always tell whether that violence was organized warfare, small-scale feuding, ritualized conflict, or a mix that changed over time. Still, the pattern is there. In multiple parts of the Americas, especially during periods of environmental instability, we see more defensive sites, more clustered settlements, more signs that people were anxious about their neighbours. Those environmental shocks could take many forms. A decades-long drought that withers crops and reduces river flow. A series of catastrophic floods that strip topsoil and drown low-lying fields. A cold snap that shortens growing seasons. In coastal areas, storms and shifting shorelines that undermine fisheries and salt production. We know from tree rings, lake sediments and ice cores that the climate of the last few thousand years was anything but steady. Megadroughts lasting a generation or more struck parts of North and South America. Flood regimes changed, monsoon systems wobbled. Layer those natural shifts on top of increasingly complex societies that depended on irrigation canals, terraced fields, long-distance trade, and intricate political alliances, and you have a recipe for instability. If the river that feeds your canal system drops for 10 straight years, the problem is not just that crops fail. The whole web of obligations built on those harvests begins to fray. Farmers can no longer deliver the surplus promised to chiefs or priestly lineages. Elites can no longer sponsor the feasts and rituals that legitimize their authority. Traders arrive with fewer goods, or stop coming at all. People begin to ask whether the current leaders really know how to keep the universe in balance. In that context, conflict can bloom in many directions at once. Some communities may raid their neighbours' fields or storage houses. Others may splinter, with factions leaving to seek better land elsewhere. Former allies may become competitors for control of the last reliable water sources or the most fertile terraces. Trade breakdowns add another layer. For centuries, a village might have relied on obsidian from one volcanic region, shells from a distant coast, copper from far to the north or south. Those materials are not just useful, they are woven into status symbols, marriage payments, and rituals. If tensions or disasters sever those roots, a community can lose both material resources and the social glue that bound it into a wider world. A chief who can no longer access prestige goods loses face. A ritual that requires a specific shell or stone becomes impossible to perform as it was before. This is where the word collapse often enters books and documentaries. But collapse is a slippery term. When archaeologists say that a culture collapsed, they usually mean that certain institutions broke down, centralized leadership dissolved, big construction projects stopped, long-distance trade shrank, monumental architecture was abandoned or repurposed. What almost never happens is that the people themselves simply vanish. Farmers stop building huge ceremonial platforms and return to smaller local shrines. City dwellers disperse into hill villages or river hamlets. A royal lineage loses power, and its symbols are quietly dropped, while family and clan identities endure. From the ground's point of view, this can look like an ending. The great plazas and temple mounds fall silent. The densest, most artifact-rich layers stop accumulating. But if you walk a few kilometers into the surrounding countryside, if you could, in that time, you might find those same families still planting fields, still telling stories, now under different leaders and different skies. The Americas offer many examples of this kind of fragmentation and reorganization. In some regions, large nucleated towns give way to smaller scattered settlements after a drought episode. In others, power seems to shift from one valley to a neighbouring one, with an old centre fading as a new one rises. Earthworks that once anchored regional ceremonies fall out of use, while new ceremonial complexes appear along different rivers. Pottery styles associated with an earlier power centre decline, while hybrid styles emerge that blend motifs from several traditions, evidence that people and ideas are mixing in new ways. Even in places where there is clear evidence of conflict, burned layers, hastily built defences, mass graves, later periods often show continuity in everyday tools and foodways. The political map has changed, the deep skills of farming, cooking and crafting have not. For the first Americans, as for people everywhere, episodes of stress and violence were real, but they were chapters, not the whole story. Institutions rose and fell, alliances shifted. Some ways of life proved too rigid and cracked under pressure. Others bent, fragmented, then recombined into new forms. When we talk about collapse, it may be more accurate and more respectful to imagine not an empty landscape, but a crowded, complicated one, full of people making hard choices, negotiating new identities, and carrying older lineages forward through the rubble of failed systems. Out of those troubled centuries, new patterns of life emerged, and with them came another invisible force that would change the fate of the Americas forever. The movement of disease, long before anyone from Europe set foot on these shores. Disease is a quiet passenger in this story. It rarely leaves dramatic ruins. It doesn't carve monuments or raise mounds. It moves through breath and water and touch, flares for a season or a decade, then fades, leaving behind only patterns, gaps in cemeteries, changes in age at death, villages that suddenly contract, stories about bad years when many people died. After Europeans arrived in the Americas, we can see epidemic disease clearly, almost painfully. In some regions, written records from missionaries, soldiers, and local chroniclers describe waves of sickness that swept through communities that had never seen smallpox, measles, influenza, or whooping cough. They talk about towns reduced by half or more in a single generation, about fields left unplanted because there were too few people to work them, about children raising younger siblings because most of the adults were gone. Archaeology and genetics back this up. Burial grounds in some areas show sudden spikes in the number of interments during the decades after contact. Skeletons that had once clustered tightly around central plazas begin to appear in smaller, scattered groups as survivors reorganize their living arrangements. In some places, pollen records show fields going back to forest within a human lifetime, a sign that large areas of cultivated land were no longer being maintained. Genetic studies of modern indigenous populations, where communities choose to participate, often show signs of a severe population bottleneck roughly in the last 500 years, exactly when European-introduced diseases were moving through the continents. So, for the post-contact period, the broad picture is not really in doubt. Epidemics, layered on top of war, forced labour and displacement, caused immense population loss in many regions. The trickier question is what came before. Were large-scale epidemics already moving through the Americas long before Columbus, carried along trade routes and river corridors just as in Eurasia and Africa? Or were most diseases pre-contact more localized, serious, but not the kind of continent-spanning plagues that later observers described? Scholars do not completely agree, and the evidence is fragmentary. We know that the first Americans lived with disease from the beginning. All human communities do. Parasites, intestinal infections, childhood fevers. These are as old as our species. Skeletons from pre-contact sites show signs of chronic infections, changes in bone texture that suggest long-standing inflammation, healed lesions from diseases like tuberculosis or treponemal infections in some regions. Dental remains show enamel defects, the faint lines left by childhood episodes of fever or malnutrition. In swampy or riverine environments, people would have been exposed to waterborne pathogens and mosquito-borne illnesses, even if we cannot name the exact species involved. We also know that the Americas had their own crowd diseases, though probably fewer than Eurasia. In Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa, many of the classic epidemic pathogens, smallpox, measles, some strains of influenza, evolved in tandem with domesticated herd animals and huge, densely packed cities. In the Americas, there were domesticated animals and large towns, but the mix was different. Llamas and alpacas in the Andes, turkeys in parts of North America, guinea pigs in some highland regions, dogs almost everywhere, enough to transmit some zoonotic diseases, but not the same menagerie that gave rise to Old World plagues. Urban centres like Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, Cahokia, and major Andean cities could certainly have supported epidemics, but their histories span only a portion of the pre-contact era and are unevenly studied. Some researchers argue that this means pre-contact epidemics were probably less frequent and less devastating at a continental scale, especially in areas without very large cities. Others caution that absence of clear evidence is not proof of absence. They point to things like sudden demographic shifts in burial populations where the ratio of children to adults changes sharply in a short time. Oral traditions that recall periods of mysterious sickness, where the breath was bad or people died in their sleep, or the spots came and did not leave. Signs of rapid abandonment at specific sites without obvious evidence of war or fire, houses left standing but not rebuilt, storage pits still partially filled. None of these on their own prove an epidemic, Famines can also change age profiles in cemeteries. People can leave a town for many reasons. Oral traditions compress and metaphorize events. But together, these hints suggest that waves of disease almost certainly passed through indigenous Americas before European contact, even if we cannot always trace their exact paths or name the pathogens involved. Whatever the details, disease never acts alone. It feeds on other kinds of stress, and it amplifies them in return. If nutrition is poor because of drought, crop failure, disrupted hunting, or loss of access to key fisheries, immune systems are weaker. A childhood illness that would have been survivable in well-fed bodies becomes lethal. In skeletons, this sometimes shows up as a double signature: enamel defects from early life stress, coupled with signs of later infection. If communities are at war or fleeing from conflict, people crowd into makeshift camps, sleep in damp shelters, drink from contaminated water sources. Wounds become infected. Respiratory diseases spread faster in close quarters. Trade routes, once peaceful channels of goods and information, become vectors for pathogens moving between anxious, displaced populations. If people are forced off their lands, as too often happened after European arrival, they lose not just calories but familiar medicines. Many indigenous healing traditions relied on deep knowledge of local plants, springs, clays, and rituals. When communities were moved, often violently, to new environments, that knowledge could not be transferred overnight. A plant that treated fevers in one valley might not grow in the new reservation. Healers might die in an epidemic, and with them specific recipes and practices. Under those conditions, each new disease wave hits harder than the last. And with every sharp population decline, something else happens. The social web that holds knowledge together starts to fray. Imagine a village where half the adults die within a few years. Children survive, but the grandparents who remembered older stories are gone. The specialists, master potters, ritual leaders, navigators, irrigation engineers, may be overrepresented among the dead simply by bad luck. The survivors are busy with immediate needs: planting, hunting, caring for orphans, negotiating with new neighbours or colonial officials. Elaborate ceremonies are simplified or suspended. Some crafts are no longer taught in full because there is no time, or because the materials are no longer available, or because the key teacher is gone. 2 or 3 generations later, people are still there. But when they look at the overgrown mound in the distance, or the stone lines half buried in the riverbank, they may not remember exactly who built them or why. To later archaeologists, this can look like a sharp break, a mysterious disappearance, a site with clear signs of earlier occupation, then a gap, then a different pattern of settlement and material culture. Some of those gaps are real breaks in local occupation. Others may be illusions created by disease-accelerated social change, traditions thinning out, leadership structures collapsing, settlement locations shifting a few miles away, crafts becoming simpler or more local in style. The loss is still real, but it is not always a clean before and after. For the first Americans, epidemic disease, whether homegrown or imported, was one thread woven into a larger fabric of climate shocks, political upheaval, warfare, and forced migration. In the centuries after European contact, that thread thickened dramatically, driving some of the fastest and most traumatic population changes in human history. Those changes did not just kill people, they scrambled maps of identity, memory, and belonging, reshaping nations across 2 continents. To understand how the disappearance of earlier worlds gave rise to the colonial Americas we know from textbooks, we have to follow that process into its next phase, the age when conquest, missionization, and new economic systems collided with already stressed societies, and the map of the Americas was redrawn. When European empires moved into the Americas, they did not arrive as a single event. They came as a long series of pressures that piled on top of each other, decade after decade, century after century. At first, in many regions, it looked like trading. Ships on the horizon. Strange goods, metal knives, glass beads, wool cloth, muskets. Local leaders weighing risks and opportunities, trying to fold these newcomers into existing systems of alliance, diplomacy, and ritual exchange. In some places, this went on for a surprisingly long time, with indigenous polities treating Europeans as just one more powerful neighbour in a landscape they already knew how to manage. But behind those first contacts, an entire world was moving. Colonial governments wanted land, labour, and profit. Missionaries wanted souls. Merchants wanted furs, silver, sugar, tobacco, hides, timber. Soldiers wanted glory, pay, and promotion. All of them carried their own ideas about what should count as a real nation, a legitimate leader, a proper way of using land. Bit by bit, the ground rules shifted. Mission stations and forts appeared along coasts and rivers. Some indigenous communities moved toward them voluntarily at first, hoping for protection from rival groups or access to new trade goods. Others were coerced, their existing villages declared idolatrous, disorderly, or simply in the way. Missionization was more than a change of religion. It was a change of daily rhythm, bells instead of drums marking time. Fixed schedules for work and prayer. Children taken into mission schools, sometimes forbidden to speak their languages. Fields reorganized according to European crops and ploughing methods. Houses rebuilt in neat rows around chapels, erasing older patterns of plaza and sacred space. On paper, this could look like progress to colonial observers. In practice, it often meant displacement from ancestral lands, loss of access to traditional hunting and gathering grounds, and the unravelling of older social networks. Then there was slavery. In some regions, like the Caribbean and parts of Brazil, indigenous peoples were directly enslaved in large numbers in the early colonial period. They were forced into mines, plantations, and households, often under brutal conditions. When disease and overwork reduced their numbers, colonizers imported enslaved Africans, creating new multi-ethnic societies in which indigenous people were sometimes pushed to the margins, sometimes folded into new categories like mixed or free-coloured. Elsewhere, systems that were not technically called slavery operated very much like it. Tribute labour drafts, debt peonage, forced relocations to work in mines, logging camps or haciendas for months or years at a time. People might still be counted as members of their home nations, but their bodies were somewhere else, their labour and time consumed by colonial economies. With every new demand, this much silver, this many hides, this year's shipment of timber, indigenous communities faced harder choices. Do you move closer to the mission to avoid slave raids from another colony? Do you accept a treaty that consolidates your people onto a smaller territory in hopes of preserving at least some autonomy? Do you join a colonial military campaign against your neighbours, because the alternative is being treated as enemies yourselves? Under that kind of pressure, nations began to reshape themselves. Some groups consolidated deliberately. Imagine 3 or 4 villages that had once been loosely allied, each with its own name, its own ceremonial cycle, its own cluster of sacred places. After a generation of epidemics, raids, and land seizures, each village is down to a few families. Alone they are vulnerable. Together they might still form a polity that colonial authorities have to reckon with. So leaders negotiate mergers, people move, marriage rules are adjusted. New councils are formed that blend representatives from formerly separate communities. A new umbrella name might be adopted, or an old name might be repurposed to cover a much larger, more diverse group. On a colonial map, this might appear as a simple fact. Tribe X occupies this region. The older reality, half a dozen intertwined peoples, each with their own history, vanishes into a single line of ink. Other consolidations were not voluntary. Colonial governments drew boundaries on paper and then tried to make reality match. In Spanish America, reductions and congregaciones gathered dispersed indigenous settlements into fewer, larger towns, easier to tax and supervise. In North America, treaties and later reservation policies pushed scattered bands onto limited parcels of land, sometimes hundreds of miles from their homelands. People who had once lived apart for good reasons, language differences, rivalries, ecological specialization, were now told they belonged to one tribe or pueblo or Indian nation because it was administratively convenient. Within those new containers, identities had to be renegotiated. Who speaks in council? Which rituals are kept? Which are adapted? Which are quietly performed out of sight of missionaries or agents? Which language becomes the everyday tongue, and which survives only in prayers, songs, or names? From the outside, later, historians might see only the name that survived into the records. On one page, in a 17th century report, a list of small nations along a river. A century later, a map showing only one tribal label in that same region. It is tempting to say those smaller nations disappeared, but often what disappeared was not the people. It was their separate recognition. This is one of the quiet tricks of colonial documentation. Powerful states decide what counts as a unit worth naming. They make censuses, treaty lists, parish registers, military reports. If an indigenous group does not appear as a separate line in those documents, later readers may assume it ceased to exist. Maybe its people were absorbed into a neighbouring nation. Maybe they took on the name of a mission town. Maybe they were reclassified as peasants, citizens, or mestizos. Maybe they simply moved across an imperial border and show up under a different label in another archive. From the point of view of the file cabinet, they are gone. From the point of view of lived reality, they may still be there, marrying, farming, hunting, holding ceremonies, telling origin stories that trace back to places and names the paperwork forgot. Even where population loss was catastrophic, survival took many forms. Some communities maintained continuity in place, holding on to core territories despite war and disease, adapting leadership structures to fit new legal frameworks, while quietly keeping older laws alive. Others survived by mobility, slipping between frontiers, moving seasonally or strategically to avoid the tightest colonial control. In some regions, people adopted Christianity, while preserving indigenous cosmologies in layered ways, mapping saints onto older spirits, fitting ancestral stories into biblical frameworks. Outwardly, this could look like cultural replacement. In practice, it was often a complex negotiation, a way to protect key elements of identity under hostile watch. In family stories, you can sometimes hear the echo of this continuity. A grandmother who insists on certain food taboos because that's how our people do it, even if the colonial name of that people has changed 3 times in official documents. A song that is always sung at planting, whose words are half understood, but whose melody carries an older rhythm. A place on the landscape that is still visited, even if the markers of ownership on a land registry say otherwise. When we read about indigenous nations disappearing after contact, we are often seeing 3 overlapping things. Real demographic collapse from disease, war, and exploitation. Forced political consolidation and relocation, which reduced the number of named communities on maps. And the selective gaze of colonial power, which chose which identities to record, which to merge, and which to ignore. The tragedy is immense. Entire lineages ended. Languages fell silent. Sacred sites were flooded behind dams, buried under cities, fenced off for private use. But the story does not stop at loss. Across the Americas, there are indigenous nations today whose ancestors lived through every one of these shocks: epidemics, missions, slaving raids, removals, allotments, boarding schools, and who are still here, speaking their languages, reviving their ceremonies, researching their histories, and asserting their rights. Their existence is a direct rebuttal to the idea of clean disappearance. What changed more often were the labels, the boundaries, and the vantage point from which outsiders were looking. To follow the first Americans into the present, we have to look past the colonial paperwork and listen for deeper continuities, ones that sometimes show up not in stone ruins or official maps, but in DNA, in spoken words, and in stories carried across centuries of upheaval. So let's follow those continuities. Start with the quietest record of all, DNA. When scientists talk about ancient DNA, they're working with fragments, tiny shreds of genetic material scraped from teeth, bones, sometimes even old chewing gum made of spruce resin. In many parts of the Americas, climate, soil, and time have been harsh on bone. Preservation is patchy, biased toward caves, dry places, cold environments, elite burials, and sheer luck. From this scattered archive, patterns begin to appear. When researchers sequence DNA from remains that are 10,000, 5,000, 1,000 years old, and compare it to the DNA of living indigenous peoples, they can sometimes see lines of continuity, shared variants that say, in effect, these people and these people are part of the same long story. In some regions, like parts of the Arctic and the Andes, those signals are surprisingly strong. They suggest that people living there today are, in a genetic sense, local descendants of communities that have been there for many thousands of years. But there are also breaks, twists, and strange detours. Sometimes an ancient genome from a particular valley has no obvious close match among people who live there now, but does resemble groups hundreds or thousands of miles away. That might hint at migrations, population replacements, or fusions that don't fit neatly with the archaeological layers or the colonial era ethnographies. And sometimes there's just silence. Entire regions have little or no ancient DNA sampled. Others are politically or ethically off-limits because descendant communities have, very reasonably, said no to further disturbance of ancestral graves. The ancient DNA we do have is not a random sample of the first Americans. It's a small, skewed set of individuals, filtered by preservation, excavation history, and modern consent. So ancient DNA can say powerful things. It can show that the people of the Americas are not recent arrivals, but deeply rooted lineages stretching back to the first migrations and branching again and again in place. It can reveal unexpected ties between coastal and inland groups, between the Arctic and the highlands, between river valleys that look separate on a map, but were connected by marriage and movement. But it cannot tell us everything. It can't explain what people called themselves, which stories they told about their ancestors, which alliances held them together, or how they understood a river, a mountain, a sky full of constellations. It can't distinguish between a group that vanished and a group that changed its name, adopted new neighbours, and carried on. For that we turn to language. Languages move with people, but not in straight lines. When linguists map indigenous languages across the Americas, they see families and branches and distant cousins, clusters like Algonquian, Athabascan, Mayan, Quechuan. Within each, dozens of separate languages, some still spoken, others sleeping in old word lists, grammars and recordings. By comparing vocabulary and grammar, linguists can infer which languages share a common ancestor, and sometimes estimate how long ago that ancestor was spoken. Taken together, these language trees suggest waves of movement and expansion, a cluster of related languages spreading along a river and out onto a plain. A single family splitting as people move into different ecological zones, each branch adapting to its own environment and its own neighbours. In broad strokes, you can see echoes of migration, groups that must have travelled north along the coast or inland across the plains, centuries or millennia before anyone wrote their names down. But language is slippery. People can adopt a new language without moving very far, especially under pressure from powerful neighbours mission schools, or trade networks. They can keep an old language while intermarrying widely and absorbing newcomers. They can blend tongues into creoles and mixed languages that don't fit comfortably on family trees. A shared language family does not necessarily mean a simple shared origin story, and the boundaries between languages and dialects are often drawn by outsiders for convenience, not by speakers themselves. So languages map movement and contact, but imperfectly. They highlight corridors of interaction, trade routes, ritual networks, political alliances that may or may not leave a strong genetic or archaeological trace. They preserve hints of ancient environments and technologies in loanwords for boats, crops, animals, and tools. They can even carry faint shadows of much older worlds in shared mythic vocabulary, which brings us to oral traditions. For a long time, many historians and archaeologists treated oral histories as colourful but unreliable. Stories, myths, legends, interesting, but not evidence in the same way as bones or pottery. That view has been steadily and necessarily challenged, because oral traditions can do something that no shard of pottery can. They can carry meaning. Across the Americas, indigenous nations maintain stories that reach far back in time. Narratives of migrations along specific rivers, accounts of great floods, volcanic eruptions and lands that sank, tales that place ancestors on particular mountains, at particular springs, in relation to particular animal nations and spirit beings. Sometimes, when researchers listen carefully and compare these stories with geological and archaeological records, startling convergences appear. A tradition about a coastal people fleeing an advancing sea may align with evidence of post-glacial sea level rise. A story about the time when fire rained from the sky might match a known volcanic eruption that left ash across a region. Migration stories that trace a path through named valleys can correspond to archaeological sequences of changing material culture. Does that mean every story is a literal memory of a specific event? Not necessarily. Oral traditions are living things. They adapt. They are retold for new circumstances, shaped by each generation's needs, values, and politics. Sacred narratives encode law, ethics, and cosmology as much as history. Some elements may be metaphorical or exist in mythic time rather than calendar time, but that doesn't make them vague. On the contrary, oral histories often preserve fine-grained knowledge about landscapes, species, climate, and past relationships with neighbours' knowledge that can complement, correct, or completely reframe outside interpretations of the archaeological record. The limits are real. Oral narratives are not meant to be mined for data points, while ignoring the people who tell them. They are part of ongoing cultural practice, sometimes restricted, sometimes misunderstood if taken out of context. And like DNA and language, they give us one angle of vision, not the whole picture. The real power emerges when these lines of evidence talk to each other, a genetic signal of continuity in a mountain valley, a language family that branches in that same region, and an oral tradition that roots a people's origin in those very peaks. All three together build a strong case for deep local presence. In another place, things may not line up so neatly. Ancient DNA suggests a population turnover. Linguistic evidence points to a relatively recent expansion of a language family into the area. Oral histories, meanwhile, insist on an origin that reaches back to the beginning of the world. That doesn't mean any one line of evidence is wrong. It might mean our understanding of migration is too simplistic, that we're missing layers of fusion and adoption, or that we're misreading what origin means in a given tradition. Sometimes the contradictions are the most instructive part. They remind us that words like disappearance, replacement, and even first can hide complex realities. Small groups merging into larger confederations, languages shifting while ritual knowledge stays put, genes moving through marriage long after names on maps have changed. And they ask us for humility. Every decade, methods improve. New ancient genomes are sequenced, Linguists recover and revitalize languages once thought lost, opening fresh windows onto old relationships. Indigenous scholars lead research grounded in their own communities' histories and priorities, bringing oral traditions into conversation with lab-based science on equal terms. As that happens, stories we thought we knew about the first Americans and about their supposed disappearance keep changing. Not because the past is shifting under our feet, but because our tools for listening to it are getting sharper, and because more voices are being heard. The mystery isn't solved and filed away. It is being reframed piece by piece. And in that reframing lies one last layer of the story. So let's take stock gently before we drift towards sleep. When people ask, why did the first Americans disappear? They're often picturing something simple and sudden. A thriving culture, and then nothing. Empty villages, abandoned fields, a word like mysterious stamped on top. But by now you've seen how rarely that's what actually happened. Most so-called disappearances turn out, on closer inspection, to be something else. Sometimes they're transformations. A hunting band settling down, adopting agriculture, changing their tools and their houses and even their clan names. To an outside archaeologist, it can look like one culture vanished and another appeared. To the people living through it, it might have felt like continuity. Grandparents teaching grandchildren, old songs sung in new plazas. Sometimes they're migrations. A river changes course, a drought drags on, a new trade opportunity opens in a distant valley. People move. They take their language, their kin ties, their sacred bundles with them. The old site goes quiet, the new site lights up. If you only dig in one place, it looks like an ending. If you follow the trail, it's just a bend in the road. Sometimes they're fusions, 2 or 3 small groups, each too vulnerable to stand alone, marry into one another, and form a new community. Pottery styles blend, house layouts change, clan structures are reworked. Outsiders centuries later slap on a new ethnographic label and talk about a new people replacing an old one. Underneath, many of the same lineages are still there, now woven together instead of living apart. And sometimes they're just gaps. Gaps in what survives. Gaps in where we've looked. Gaps created by the very reasonable decision of descendant communities to say enough excavation, enough disturbance. In the spaces between radiocarbon dates, between one language map and another, between one version of a story and the next, we're tempted to imagine a disappearance because it feels like something should be there. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Often it's evidence of erosion or of time, or of our own limited attention. So when we talk about the first Americans disappearing, it's worth reframing the question, not where did they go, but how did they change? Where did they move? Who did they join? What traces did they leave in the genomes, languages and stories of people still here? Think back over a few of the leading scenarios we've met tonight. There's the idea of climatic shock. As the Ice Age ended, huge animals vanished or were pushed to refuges, coastlines drowned, and old ways of life were stressed. In some regions, we see clear signs of population decline and settlement abandonment that fit with this picture. To strengthen that scenario, we'd like to see tight correlations between climate records, layers of megafaunal bones, and shifts in tools or diet in multiple distant regions at the same time. To weaken it, we'd need strong evidence of communities sailing through those changes without major disruption. There's the migration and fusion model. Populations splitting, rejoining, expanding along rivers and coasts, then merging into new political formations. Archaeologically, that shows up as blended material culture, overlapping burial practices, and staggered dates of appearance across a landscape. Linguistically, we might see borrowing in both directions or languages with mixed structures that point to long-term bilingualism. Genetic data can add another layer. signals of admixture rather than clean replacement. When all three converge, the storyline of they disappeared starts to look more like they moved, they married, they redefined who we were. And then there are the true gaps. Places where an archaeological tradition ends and for 1,000 years or more we simply don't know who was there. No clear successor culture, no continuous language record, sparse or no ancient DNA. In those cases the mystery is real. Future discoveries could tip us toward one explanation or another. A buried village complex here, a newly sequenced genome there, an oral tradition recorded and shared on its own terms, suddenly illuminating a stretch of time that our shovels never touched. All of these possibilities sit side by side. The past of the Americas is not a single neat puzzle picture waiting to be snapped together. It's more like several overlapping jigsaw puzzles on the same table. Pieces from one mixed into the others, some pieces missing, some still in the box. Our job is not to force them into a single image, but to notice patterns, respect uncertainties, and leave room for more pieces to arrive. Before we start our gentle descent into the end of the story, a small practical note from the waking world. If you've been enjoying drifting off with these long journeys into deep time, there's a book that follows the same path. Slow, careful, curious history designed to be read at night. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. And, just for this week, there's a discount there if you'd like a quieter, page-turning companion to these episodes. You can tuck that away for tomorrow. For tonight, we circle back to what we can say with some confidence, and what we should hold lightly. With reasonable confidence, we can say that the first peoples of the Americas did not simply appear suddenly and vanish just as abruptly. Their ancestors moved gradually into new lands, adapting and redapting to ice, grassland, forest, and desert. They built networks of kinship and exchange. They experimented with how to live as foragers, gardeners, farmers, traders, city builders. We can say that many of the endings we see in the record are really reorganizations. A drought ends one pattern of settlement and begins another. A new crop spreads and reshapes diets and rituals. A confederation dissolves. Its member nations persist under new names, in new alliances. We can say that living indigenous peoples across the Americas are not footnotes but central characters in this story. Their DNA, their languages, and their oral histories show deep continuities with those first arrivals, even as centuries of movement, contact, and catastrophe have layered new complexities on top. What remains open are the fine details. Who, exactly, walked from this valley to that one in a given century? Which name a people used for themselves before anyone wrote it down? How they understood a comet in the sky, an unexpected frost, a stranger arriving by canoe. Whether a particular cultural break represents a demographic change, a shift in leadership, a religious revolution, or something we don't yet have words for. Those are questions that may never be fully answered, and that's all right. Mysteries don't have to be solved to be meaningful. Sometimes it's enough to know that under our feet lies a palimpsest of journeys, choices, and dreams, most of them anonymous, all of them necessary to bring the present into being. So as we move to our final moments together, you might let the big, sharp questions soften a little. Instead of why did they disappear? Perhaps, how did they endure? How did they change? What traces of their decisions, their fears, their hopes are still quietly alive in the world around me and in the people I might meet tomorrow? If you'd like, you can carry those questions with you into sleep, and when you're awake again, into conversation. This channel lives on curiosity and reflection. If a particular part of tonight's journey caught your attention, a theory you'd like to hear more about, a region you feel connected to, a story from your own community, you're welcome to share it, add nuance, or gently disagree. For now, though, we'll let the arguments of scholars, the clatter of excavation tools, and the hum of laboratory machines fade into the background. The puzzle pieces will still be there in the morning. In the last section, we'll step back even further, beyond theories and timelines, and say goodnight from the long, slow river of deep time itself. So let's follow that river a little way, just long enough to say goodnight. When people say the first Americans disappeared, what they're often really noticing is something more ordinary and, in its own way, more beautiful. Change. Lines of pottery designs bending and curling into new motifs. House walls shifting from one material to another. Stories trading old names for new landscapes. Alliances fraying here and tightening there. Children growing up in a world their grandparents would still recognize, but just barely. On a timescale of decades, those changes are slow. On a timescale of centuries, they're dramatic. On a timescale of thousands of years, they can look like vanishing. But the people are almost never gone in the way the word disappear suggests. Their descendants are still arguing, laughing, planting, remembering. Their choices are still shaping riverbanks and migration paths and the layout of towns. Their languages may be braided together with others, or pushed to the edges, or sleeping between the lines of a prayer or a place name. Yet traces remain. Change, not erasure. Sometimes the change is gentle. A new crop, a new festival, a new ritual layered on top of older ones. Sometimes it's harsh. War, epidemic, forced removal. Entire communities broken apart, their survivors folded willingly or not into other peoples. And sometimes, from our vantage point, it's simply unknown. A gap in our tools, not in their existence. From deep time's perspective, all of these look the same, continuous motion. Populations branching and rejoining, ideas leaping from valley to valley faster than genes. Names rising and falling like waves. The first Americans did not stand outside that flow. They were the flow. They were part of the same long experiment that began when those small bands of humans, far away and long ago, walked out of Africa and refused to stop walking. If your eyes are heavy now, you might imagine the continent as it was 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, and let the details blur. Ice withdrawing like a slow curtain, grass and forest filling in behind, rivers carving new paths, coastlines reshaping themselves. On that moving stage, people cross and recross the same passes, the same fords, the same sheltered bays, generation after generation. They build camps, then villages, then towns. They argue over hunting rights and marriage rules. They tell origin stories around fires, point to mountains and stars and say, "We came from there." Behind them, other people had once said the same thing in other languages with other names for the mountains and the stars. Ahead of them, still others would come. No single group is the beginning. No single moment is the end. You and I are just very late arrivals to the audience, stepping into the theatre long after the play has begun, trying to reconstruct the first acts from a few surviving lines of dialogue and some footprints on the stage. We can't hear every word, we can't see every scene, but we can know that the play did not simply stop one night in the middle of a sentence. The actors walked off stage as different people than when they walked on. That's what humans do as you rest. You might let that sense of continuity wrap around you. The idea that where you are right now, whatever bed, whatever sofa, whatever floor stands on a layering of lives. People who stood there before you or nearby, thousands of years apart, thinking their own sharp, immediate thoughts, none of them imagining that one day someone would lie awake and wonder if they had disappeared. They didn't. They changed, they moved, they were changed by others. And some part of them, however small, is still moving through the world. If you'd like to keep that conversation with the past going when you're awake again, it helps us more than you might think to have you gently tap the buttons that keep this channel alive. When you have a spare moment tomorrow, you can like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a comment. It nudges the algorithms in ways I don't fully understand. But it does make it easier for other sleepy history seekers to find their way here. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Which part of the world you're drifting off in tonight. A city, a region, a river or mountain you feel tied to. It's a small way of watching the modern map light up, with echoes of all the older maps underneath. If these long, slow wanderings through prehistory are soothing for you, there's also a book waiting quietly for you whenever you're ready. It dives into more of these prehistoric secrets in the same calm, curious tone, built to be read at night, a few pages at a time. You can learn more about it, and if you'd like, pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. No rush. It will be there tomorrow and the day after, just like the questions we've been asking. For now, you don't have to remember climate graphs or dates or names of cultures. You don't have to sort out which theory you find most convincing. You're allowed to set all of that down. You can simply notice that the story of the first Americans is not a riddle with a missing answer. It's a chapter in a much longer book, a book written in river deltas and pollen grains, in stories passed from grandparent to grandchild, in the quiet persistence of people who refused to vanish, even when the world tried to make them. If your mind drifts, you can follow it, back along the Bering Land Bridge, under a sky full of unfamiliar constellations, down the Pacific coast in small boats, listening to the hiss of waves against the hull, across interior plains rich with animals we will never see alive, into forests where new plants are tested cautiously. Is this food, medicine, poison, or some mix of the three? Everywhere the same questions. Where is the water? Where will we sleep? Who counts as us? What do we owe the ones who came before, and the ones who will come after? They are the same questions we quietly carry today, dressed up in different clothes. So as you settle, you might feel yourself as part of that chain. Not the end point, not the beginning, just one more link, doing your best with the small stretch of time you've been given. If sleep comes for you in the next few breaths, you can let it. The history will wait, the puzzles will wait, the people of the past who lived whole lives without ever hearing words like Paleo-Indian or Clovis or First Americans have already done their part. You're not responsible for solving their mysteries before you rest. All you have to do is breathe in and out. Ice advances. Ice retreats. People move, adapt, remember, forget, remember again. Cultures rise, combine, rename themselves. Nothing truly disappears. It just flows into something else. From the long, slow perspective of deep time, tonight is one more small wave on that great tide. You are carried by it, as they were. So, wherever you're listening from, on whatever land, under whatever sky, I wish you a quiet night, a soft pillow, and the comforting knowledge that you are surrounded, always, by the invisible company of those who came before. Rest well. Good night from deep time.